The train didn't slow down the way she expected it to. Evelyn Hart had been watching out the window for the better part of an hour, her face close enough to the glass that her breath fogged a small circle against it, waiting for the lights of a town. She'd been told Cedar Ridge was the stop after Harmon's Crossing, and she'd counted the stops carefully, the way her mother had always told her to count things when she was nervous: pennies, steps, seconds between thunder and lightning. Counting gave the hand something to do when the mind was too loud to be useful. But when the train lurched to a stop, there were no lights. No platform with a lantern swinging from a post. No station master in a coat. Just a wooden sign half buried in scrub grass that she had to press her face against the window to read. And even then, she could only make out the first two letters before the train's brakes hissed and the conductor came through the car calling the name she'd written on her ticket. Cedar Ridge Stop. Anyone for Cedar Ridge. She grabbed both suitcases from the rack above her seat. The larger one caught on something, and she had to yank it twice, hard enough that the woman across the aisle gave her a look, and made her way down the narrow passage between the seats. Her coat was still half-buttoned. She hadn't expected to arrive so quickly after Harmon's Crossing. She hadn't expected a lot of things. The conductor helped her down the steps with a kind of professional efficiency that suggested he was already thinking about the next stop. He set her larger case on the ground beside her and tipped his hat. "Someone meeting you?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "I believe so." He looked at the empty land around them, the scrub, the darkness beginning to creep in from the east, the wooden sign, a hitching post with no horse tied to it, and then he looked back at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not unkind, more like a man who had seen this particular situation before and knew better than to say what he was thinking. "Train'll be back through Thursday," he said. "Northbound." Then he climbed back up the steps, and the train moved. She stood there with her two suitcases and watched it go. The sound of the engine faded slower than she expected, and for a while it was the only thing she could hear, that diminishing mechanical thunder, and then it was gone. And what replaced it was a silence so complete it felt like a physical thing pressing against her ears. Evelyn Hart was 19 years old. She had $63 sewn into the lining of her coat, a letter of intent from the Cedar Ridge School Board folded in her inside pocket, and a clear, sudden understanding that no one was coming. She'd left Harrisburg 3 weeks ago with more confidence than she probably should have had. Her father had stood at the station platform with his arms folded and his jaw tight, the expression he wore when he had decided something was wrong but had run out of arguments against it. And her younger sister Clara had cried openly, which had almost broken Evelyn's resolve entirely. Almost. But she'd gotten on the train, and she'd told herself the crying was just Clara being Clara, and that her father's silence was just her father being her father, and that the ache in her chest was only the ordinary sadness of leaving, not any kind of warning. Her mother had died 2 years before, quietly, and then all at once, the way illness sometimes worked. And after that, the house in Harrisburg had felt like a place where the furniture had been rearranged in the dark, familiar enough to walk through without thinking, strange enough to make you reach for things that weren't where they used to be. Evelyn had needed to go somewhere. The teaching position in Wyoming had felt like an answer to a question she hadn't known she was asking. She'd had a correspondence with a man named Mr. Gerald Hatch, who served on the Cedar Ridge School Board and had placed the advertisement in the Pennsylvania Gazette. His letters were formal and encouraging. He described Cedar Ridge as a growing settlement with strong community values and a real need for an educated woman willing to commit to the children of the territory. He'd said someone would meet her at the station. Standing now in the gathering dusk with the wind coming down off the hills and her coat still half-buttoned, she thought about Gerald Hatch and his formal, encouraging letters, and she thought some very uncharitable thoughts. She buttoned her coat the rest of the way. The sign said Cedar Ridge. There was a rutted road leading away from the stop in 2 directions, north toward what looked like open range, south toward a cluster of low hills. She had no map. She had no lantern. She had a good pair of walking boots that had seemed more than adequate in Pennsylvania and now felt like a small and inadequate joke. She looked south toward the hills because it seemed more likely that a town would be tucked in among some hills than sitting out in the open, and because she needed to choose something. Standing still and waiting for rescue had a ceiling on it, and she could feel that ceiling. She picked up both suitcases, one in each hand, and started walking. She made it maybe a quarter mile before she had to put the larger case down and rest. The road was worse than it looked from the stop. Ruts from wagon wheels had dried in the mud from some earlier rain, making the surface uneven enough that she had to watch every step, and the larger suitcase was heavy in a way she hadn't noticed on the train when someone else had lifted it. Her arms ached from the elbows down. The wind was picking up. She sat on the larger case and tried to think clearly. The facts, as she knew them. She was somewhere in Wyoming territory. The town was called Cedar Ridge, and it was supposedly not far from this station. It was approximately 6 o'clock in the evening, maybe a little later. It would be fully dark within an hour. The temperature was dropping faster than she'd expected for what was supposed to be early autumn. The things she didn't know. How far the town actually was. Whether anyone there knew she was coming. Whether Gerald Hatch had received her last letter confirming her arrival date. Whether there were animals in the hills that she should be worried about. She pulled her letter of intent from her inside pocket and read it again. Though she'd read it so many times, the folds had started to split. It told her nothing useful. It told her she was the new school teacher for Cedar Ridge, Wyoming territory, commencing September 14th. It was signed by Gerald Hatch, Secretary, Cedar Ridge Educational Committee. September 14th was today. She folded the letter back into her pocket. A sound came from somewhere to her left, back toward the scrub beyond the road's edge. Something moving through dry grass, something medium-sized. She went very still. The sound stopped. She breathed carefully. A prairie dog appeared at the edge of the scrub, looked at her with what seemed like contempt, and vanished. She let out a breath she hadn't known she was holding. "Right," she said aloud, to no one. Her voice sounded strange out here, small against all that open sky. Right then. She picked up the suitcases and kept walking. Also, she didn't make it to town that night. What she made it to was a flat stretch of ground a little ways off the road, sheltered slightly by a stand of scrubby pines, where the wind was less aggressive and the ground was dry. By the time she got there, the light was nearly gone, and she could feel the cold settling in seriously. Not dangerous yet, she thought, but heading that direction with intent. She had a wool blanket at the top of her large suitcase, packed there deliberately because her mother had always said that cold was the first enemy on a long journey, and you should keep your warmth where you could reach it quickly. She pulled it out and wrapped it around her shoulders. She ate the last of the bread she'd bought in Cheyenne 2 days ago. She sat with her back against the larger suitcase and watched the stars come out, which happened faster out here than it ever had in Pennsylvania, the sky so dark and so wide that the stars seemed to pour into it from some reservoir she couldn't see. She was not someone who cried easily. She'd learned that about herself after her mother died. There had been a period of 2 weeks where she'd expected to cry and hadn't, and then one morning she'd cried for an hour and a half over a broken cup, and after that she'd been mostly fine. The grief had found its own path without asking her permission, so she didn't cry that night, sitting against her suitcase under the Wyoming sky. But she came close. She sat with that closeness for a while and let it be what it was, not weakness, not failure, just the ordinary human response to finding yourself very alone in a very large place. And then she pulled the blanket tighter and told herself she would be angry tomorrow, when anger would be more useful, and right now she would just get through the night. She slept in short intervals, waking each time the wind shifted or something moved in the distance. She was cold in a way that went past discomfort into a background ache she couldn't ignore. At some point, late enough that the stars had rotated in their arc, and she couldn't see the familiar patterns anymore, she heard hoofbeats on the road. She sat up. She listened. She thought about whether announcing herself was wise or not, and then she decided that being alone in the cold and dark was already the worst option, and that any alternative was worth the risk. "Hello," she called. Her voice came out rougher than she expected. She tried again, louder. "Hello, is someone there?" The hoofbeats slowed. Nathan Reed heard the voice before he saw where it was coming from. He'd been riding back from the Alderman place, which was about 3 miles south of the station, where he'd spent most of the afternoon and into the evening helping Roy Alderman shore up a fence line that had given way in the last wind. His own ranch was another 2 miles north of Cedar Ridge, and he'd been thinking about nothing more complicated than coffee and sleep when the voice came out of the dark on his left side. He pulled Cassidy up short. The horse was used to surprises but still sidestepped a little and turned toward the sound. "Hello?" he said. "Here." The voice again, from somewhere in the pines off the road. "I'm sorry to call out. I'm not..." I don't mean to startle you. He'd been out in the territory long enough that a strange voice in the dark was not something he took lightly, but there was something in the quality of it. Young, female, cold in a way that wasn't just the night air, that made him reach for the lantern on his saddle rather than the rifle under it. He held the lantern up and looked. She was sitting against a suitcase, two suitcases actually, one large and one smaller, with a wool blanket around her shoulders and her coat buttoned all the way up and a look on her face that he'd seen before, on men who'd been lost on the range and were trying very hard to look like they hadn't been. Like admitting how bad it was might make it worse. She was young, younger than he'd expected, though he wasn't sure what he'd expected. She had dark hair that had mostly escaped whatever she'd pinned it into, and her eyes were, he noticed this first before anything else, not frightened. Cautious, yes. Watchful, but not frightened. "Are you hurt?" he asked. "No," she said. "I'm cold." "How long have you been out here?" She seemed to think about it. "Since about 6, I think. The train left me. That is, there was no one at the station, and I started walking, and it got dark before I could find the town." He looked at her suitcases and then back at her. "You were going to Cedar Ridge?" "I am the new schoolteacher for Cedar Ridge," she said. There was a particular emphasis on the verb am, not was, and something about that precision made him take a second look at her. "My name is Evelyn Hart. Someone from the school board was supposed to meet me. Mr. Gerald Hatch." "Gerald Hatch moved to Denver in August," Nathan said. She stared at him. "He sold his claim and moved to Denver. Family situation, I think. The school board has been," he paused, "in some disarray." A silence stretched between them that had a lot of things in it. He watched her process what he'd told her and was impressed, despite himself, by how she did it. Not with panic, not with the kind of dramatic reaction he'd seen from people when things went sideways, but with a kind of careful, almost deliberate stillness, like she was sorting through the information and deciding what to keep. "Well," she said finally, "that explains a great deal. Can you ride?" "Not well. Doesn't need to be well. Just behind me." He swung down from Cassidy and bent to pick up the larger suitcase. It was heavy enough that he had to adjust his grip. "We'll get the bags first and then you." "You don't need to." "Ma'am," he said, not unkindly, "it's 40 degrees and dropping, and town is a mile and a half. We'll get there faster if you let me help and argue about it later." She looked at him for a moment with those watchful eyes. Then she nodded. His name was Nathan Reed, and he was not what she'd pictured when she'd imagined the men of Wyoming territory. She'd pictured something broader, rougher, more obviously Western in the way that the dime novels described. The hard jaw, the cold eyes, the laconic authority of a man shaped entirely by violence and solitude. Nathan Reed was not small, and he was not soft, and there were certainly lines in his face that spoke of weather and work, and something that might have been old trouble. But there was also a matter-of-factness about him that had nothing theatrical in it. When he tied her suitcases to the saddle, he did it the way a man tied suitcases, practically, without commentary, without performance. She rode behind him on the horse with her hands on his sides. Not his waist, she'd decided. That was too much familiarity with a stranger. And the horse's gait was steady enough that she only grabbed for him once, when the road dipped unexpectedly in the dark. She felt him register the grab, but he didn't comment on it. "How long has the school been without a teacher?" she asked, partly to fill the silence and partly because she genuinely needed to know. "Since last May," he said. "Mrs. Carson left. Her husband got sick. And before I arrived, the children have been not learning much," he said. "A couple of the older kids have been helping with the younger ones. The Dunmore girl runs a little reading group on Wednesday mornings, which is more than the school board has done." "How old is the Dunmore girl?" 14, 15, about there. Evelyn filed this away. A 14-year-old running a voluntary reading group on Wednesday mornings told her something about the children of Cedar Ridge that the school board's letters had not. It told her they were not waiting to be educated. They were hungry for it. "And the schoolhouse?" she asked. A pause. "It exists," Nathan said. "That's not very encouraging. It has a roof. Also not very encouraging." She felt something that might have been a suppressed laugh in the way his breathing changed for a moment. "The windows need work," he said, "and the floor has a soft spot on the east side, and someone left a family of raccoons take up residence in the back storage room." Raccoons. They've been evicted, mostly. Mostly. The smell lingers. She thought about the school board letters and Gerald Hatch's formal, encouraging descriptions and the phrase strong community values, and decided she was going to write a much more direct letter to whoever had replaced Gerald Hatch on the school board, and then she was going to see the schoolhouse for herself first thing in the morning, and then she was going to make a list. Lists were how her mother had handled things that seemed too large. Break them into pieces. Deal with the pieces. "Is there somewhere I can stay?" she asked. "A boarding house or—" "Martha Elwood takes in boarders," Nathan said. "Her place is at the north end of Main Street. She'll have a room." A pause. "She'll also have opinions. About everything. I'm giving you fair warning. I appreciate fair warning. She means well. Most people with opinions do." Another of those almost laughs. The horse picked its way along the road, and the lights of Cedar Ridge appeared ahead of them. Not many lights, maybe a dozen, spread along what she assumed was a main street, with a few more scattered up into the dark beyond. Smaller than she'd imagined, less impressive, in every sense. But it was there. It was real. And she was cold enough and tired enough that the sight of it made something loosen in her chest that she hadn't known was tight. "Mr. Reed," she said. "Nathan." "Nathan." She tried it. "Thank you for stopping." He didn't say of course, or think nothing of it, or any of the things people said when they wanted to make a kindness feel smaller than it was. He just said, "Yep," in a flat, uncomplicated way that she found she preferred. Cedar Ridge at night was mostly mud and lantern light, and the 2 or 3 people she saw as they came down Main Street looked at her with the frank curiosity of people who had very little new to look at. Nathan Reed brought her to Martha Elwood's boarding house, which was a 2-story frame building with a lamp burning in the front window and a wooden sign that listed slightly to the left. He helped her down from the horse and knocked on the door while she stood with her suitcases and tried to look like a competent adult who regularly spent the night sitting against her luggage in Wyoming wilderness. Martha Elwood opened the door, and she was exactly what Nathan had implied, and completely what Evelyn had expected. A small, round woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a manner that suggested she formed opinions the way other people breathed, quickly and without thinking about it. "You must be the schoolteacher," Martha said, looking Evelyn up and down in a way that missed nothing. "You're smaller than I expected." "I hear that often," Evelyn said. "You're also filthy. I spent the night beside the road." Martha looked at Nathan. "Gerald Hatch business?" "Gerald Hatch business," he confirmed. "That man," Martha said, with a succinctness that conveyed a complex and unfavorable assessment. She stood back from the door. "Come in. I've got a room on the second floor. There's water on the stove if it hasn't gone cold." Evelyn picked up her suitcases. Nathan reached for the larger one, and she almost let him take it before she thought better of it. She'd carried it this far, after all. And then she felt slightly foolish about the hesitation and just picked it up herself. She went inside. The room Martha showed her was small and clean, with a narrow bed and a window that looked out over the backyard. There was a washstand in the corner, and a hook on the door for her coat, and a braided rug on the floor that had seen better decades but was still soft underfoot. "Meals are at 6 and noon and 5, Martha said from the doorway. "I don't do late meals. Water's down the hall. Privy's out the back." "What do you charge?" Evelyn asked. Martha named a figure. It was fair, less than she'd paid in Cheyenne. "That's fine," Evelyn said. Martha looked at her a moment longer. "You gonna stay?" she asked, in a tone that suggested she'd seen new school teachers come and go before. "Some of them come out here and take one look at the place and go straight back east." "I've already spent a night outside," Evelyn said. "The hard part is done." Something shifted in Martha's face. Not warmth exactly, but a recalibration. "Sleep," she said. "Things look different in the morning." She left, and Evelyn sat on the edge of the bed and took her boots off, which was the best thing that had happened to her in several hours. She sat for a moment with her feet on the braided rug and listened to the quiet of the house, Martha's footsteps on the stairs, the creak of a settling wall, the wind outside doing what wind did. She thought about Nathan Reed saying Gerald Hatch moved to Denver in August in that flat, matter-of-fact way, like it was information she should have had, and the only reason she didn't was an administrative failure not worth belaboring. She thought about the raccoons in the back storage room. She thought about the Dunmore girl, 14 years old, running a reading group on Wednesday mornings because someone needed to. She lay back on the bed without undressing and stared at the ceiling and decided she was too tired to be angry tonight. And she could be angry tomorrow, and it would probably be more productive then anyway. She was asleep before she'd finished the thought. Check. The morning came cold and bright, in a way Wyoming mornings apparently always did. The sky was the color of good china, the air sharp enough to taste, and the light hit everything with a directness that made the world look more real than it usually did. Evelyn woke up with her coat still on, and her hair a disaster and a very clear sense of what she needed to do. She washed at the basin down the hall. She changed clothes with the efficiency of someone who didn't have the luxury of taking her time about it. She went downstairs where Martha Elwood had coffee on the stove and a pan of biscuits on the table. Two other boarders were at the table, a man named Chet, who worked at the livery and said almost nothing, and a woman named Rosalie who was visiting her sister and said quite a lot, mostly about the weather and the state of the roads. Evelyn listened and said the right things at the right moments, and ate 2 biscuits and drank the coffee, which was strong enough to be medicinal. "The schoolhouse," she said to Martha when the other boarders had gone. "Mr. Reed said it's on north end of Birch Street," Martha said. "Past the hardware. You can't miss it. It has a sign." She paused. "The sign's in bad shape." "Are there children registered?" "There are children," Martha said. "Whether they're registered depends on whether anyone's thought to do the registering." She topped up Evelyn's coffee without being asked. "The Dunmore girl, Cecily, she's been running a kind of informal thing on Wednesday mornings. Keeps the little ones from being underfoot, mostly." "So I've heard," Evelyn said. "I'd like to meet her." Martha's expression did something complicated. "She's a good girl," she said after a moment. "Stubborn. Doesn't like being told things she's already figured out herself." "I appreciate that in a person," Evelyn said. "You two might get along," Martha conceded. The schoolhouse was worse than she'd been prepared for, which meant it was worse than she'd expected even after Nathan's accounting of it. The sign out front had once said Cedar Ridge School in painted letters, and now said CER Ridge STHL, the missing pieces either fallen off or used for something else. The front door stuck in its frame and required her full weight to open, which she provided with more force than was entirely dignified. Inside, the light came through windows where 2 of the panes had been replaced with boards, and the others were so grimy they barely admitted the day. The rows of desks were there, at least 8 of them, various sizes, pushed around into no particular arrangement, as if someone had rearranged them once and then lost interest. There was a blackboard at the front that had been used and erased and used again until its surface was more gray than black. There was a stove in the corner that looked like it worked, which she checked by opening it and looking inside, and it looked like it worked. The east floor was soft, as advertised, in a patch about 3 feet across near the window. She stepped on it carefully and decided it would hold for now, but not forever. The back storage room smelled, as advertised, of raccoon. She opened the door and then closed it again quickly and put the storage room in the category of problems for later. She stood in the middle of the room and turned around slowly. She'd taught before, briefly, a year of helping at the school in Harrisburg when the regular teacher had been sick 2 or 3 months of it. She knew what a classroom felt like when it was working and what it felt like when it wasn't, and this one felt like a room that had been given up on, like a plant left unwatered until someone couldn't remember whose job the watering had been. She thought about the letters from Gerald Hatch and his descriptions of strong community values, and she thought about the soft floor and the boarded windows and the raccoon smell, and she put these things together in her mind with some precision. Then she went back to Martha Elwood's boarding house, borrowed a bucket and a scrub brush, and came back. She started with the windows. By noon, she'd cleaned 4 of the 6 windows, relocated several years of accumulated dust from horizontal surfaces, discovered that the soft spot in the floor was caused by a rotted joist that was going to need actual carpentry and not just her optimism, and established that the blackboard, underneath its layers of incompletely erased history, was salvageable. She was on a step stool doing something aggressive with a rag and the highest window when she heard the door and looked down. A girl stood in the doorway. She was maybe 15, with a narrow, serious face and her dark hair pulled back in a braid that was practical rather than decorative. She was looking at Evelyn the way people looked at things they were deciding about. "You're the new teacher," the girl said. It was not a question. "Evelyn Hart," Evelyn said from the step stool. "You're Cicely Dunmore." The girl blinked. "Martha told you." "Martha and Nathan Reed." Cicely Dunmore's expression shifted fractionally at the name. "He brought you in last night." "He did?" Evelyn climbed down from the step stool. "I've been hearing about your Wednesday reading group." "It's not much," Cicely said. "Just the little ones. They'd spend Wednesday mornings getting into trouble otherwise. I figured reading was better than that." "You figured right." Evelyn looked at her. "How many children are we talking about total? For the school?" Cicely seemed to be calculating. 11, maybe 12, who'd come regular. A few more if their parents can spare them from chores. "And what are the 11 reading currently?" "What I can find," Cicely said. "I've got 2 readers and a Bible and some newspapers from last year." Evelyn nodded. "Can you come back tomorrow morning, 6 o'clock, before school?" Cicely looked at her narrowly. "Why?" "Because I need to know what each of those 11 children knows and doesn't know before I stand in front of them on Monday, and you know them better than I do. If I'm going to teach them, I need you to tell me about them first." The narrowness eased a little. 6 o'clock is early. "Yes," Evelyn said. Cicely looked around the classroom, at the cleaned windows, the rearranged desks, the blackboard that was starting to look like a blackboard again, and then back at Evelyn. Something in her face made a decision. 6 o'clock, she said. Yeah. She didn't see Nathan Reed that afternoon, though she was aware in a vague background way that she was looking for him when she moved through the main street. Not looking for him exactly, but noting his absence, which was not quite the same thing. What she saw instead was Cedar Ridge in daylight, which was different from what she'd glimpsed by lantern light the previous night. It was small. Smaller than she'd imagined from Gerald Hatch's letters, which had described it as a growing settlement in a tone that suggested more growing had already happened than was in evidence. There was a main street with a general store and a hardware and a saloon and a livery and Martha Elwood's boarding house and not a great deal else. Beyond the main street were maybe 30 houses scattered without much plan, some well kept and some not. But there were children. She counted 7 of them in the first hour she spent walking around, ranging from a boy of about 5 who was throwing rocks at a fence post with great concentration to 2 girls of 10 or 11 who were carrying water from the well and talking to each other with the serious intensity of people conducting important business. They looked at her. She looked back. None of them spoke to her, but she noticed that the 2 girls with the water buckets slowed down when they passed the schoolhouse and looked at the windows she'd cleaned, and she noticed that they talked about it after they'd passed. She bought flour and salt and a few other things she needed at the general store, and the man behind the counter, a heavy-set man named Briggs, who had the manner of someone who kept track of things, told her the weather had been mild, but the first real cold was usually before October was out. She thanked him and filed this away. She was walking back toward the boarding house when she heard her name. Not Miss Hart, but Evelyn. And there was only one person in Cedar Ridge who knew her well enough to call her that, which was Martha Elwood, who was standing on the front step of the boarding house and beckoning with a purposeful urgency that suggested news. "Nathan Reed is here," Martha said when Evelyn reached her. "He wants to talk to you." "About what?" "He didn't say. He's in the front room." Martha paused, with the air of someone exercising real restraint. "He brought lumber." "Lumber." "For the school floor," Martha said. "I think." She paused again. "I also think he fixed the sign." Evelyn stood on the front step for a moment processing this. Then she went inside. Nathan Reed was in the front room, sitting on the edge of a chair with his hat in his hands. He had the look of a man who was more comfortable outside than in. He stood when she came in. "The floor joist," he said, without preamble. "It needs replacing. I've got timber." She looked at him. "You fixed the sign," she said. He looked mildly uncomfortable. "It was bothering me." "It was bothering you." "CEARRIDGSCHL, he said. "For 2 years." She thought about pointing out that she'd met him less than 24 hours ago, and he was already repairing her school building, and then she decided that pointing it out would make it strange when it wasn't strange. It was just what it was, a thing that needed doing, a person doing it. The floor can wait until Saturday, she said. The children start Monday. He nodded. Saturday's fine. A pause. You should know, he said, that not everyone on the school board is. There's some question about whether the position is still funded. Gerald Hatch was the one who pushed the budget through, and with him gone, who's the board chair now? Walt Dunmore. Cecily Dunmore's father? He looked at her. You know Cecily? She's coming in tomorrow at 6 to help me assess the students. Evelyn folded her hands. I'd like to speak to Walt Dunmore. He'll be at the saloon tonight, Nathan said. He usually is on Wednesdays. Then I'll speak to him at the saloon. Something moved in Nathan's expression. Not alarm exactly, more like reassessment. He's not. He paused. He can be difficult. I've been told that about people before, Evelyn said. It's rarely actually true. Usually they're just waiting for someone who takes them seriously. Nathan looked at her for a long moment in a way she couldn't entirely interpret. Not skeptical, more like someone recalibrating a prior estimate. I'll go with you, he said, if you don't mind. I don't mind, she said. And then, because it seemed true and worth saying, thank you for the lumber and the sign. He put his hat on and nodded once, the gesture of a man who knew how to accept thanks without deflecting it and without making more of it than it was. She found she appreciated that too. 10. Walt Dunmore was at the saloon as Nathan had predicted and was not as difficult as Nathan had implied. He was a big man with a big voice and the slightly guarded look of someone who'd been responsible for things that had gone wrong and was still not sure how to account for it. He'd heard she was in town. He'd heard about the schoolhouse. He said the budget was not, in fact, in question. That had been a miscommunication, and he was sorry she'd been told otherwise. And then he said that Cedar Ridge had been waiting for a proper teacher since Mrs. Carson left, and he hoped Miss Hart would find the community supportive. She thought he meant it. She also thought he was a man who'd let things slide in a crisis and was now, in the presence of a person who clearly hadn't slid anywhere, feeling the appropriate weight of that. Your daughter has been running a reading group, Evelyn said, on Wednesday mornings. Walt Dunmore's expression did something complicated and a little soft. She has, he said. She's going to be very helpful, Evelyn said. She knows the children. She knows what they need. I'd like to use that. He looked at her, and then at Nathan, and then back at her. You're not what we expected, he said. I rarely am, she said pleasantly. Walking back through the dark main street afterward, Nathan was quiet for a while. Then he said, That went better than I expected. I told you, Evelyn said. You did, he agreed. The stars were out again. Fewer clouds than the night before, the sky very clear and very cold. She could see her breath. Do you have family here? She asked. In Cedar Ridge? No, he said. I've got a ranch north of town. 2 hired hands, some cattle. He paused. That's about it. She looked at him sideways. That's not very much. No, he said. It's not. She didn't ask what had brought him here, or where he was from, or what he'd left behind, because those felt like questions that had their own time, their own weight, and she'd only known him for a day and a fraction. But she filed the answer away. That's not very much. And thought about the way he'd said it. Not self-pity, more like an honest accounting. She was getting better, she thought, at reading the way he meant things. That probably meant something, though she wasn't sure yet what. But the school opened on Monday with 9 children in attendance, and Cecily Dunmore sitting in the back row with the expression of someone who had agreed to this arrangement under protest, but was reserving the right to intervene if necessary. The 9 children ranged from 5 to 12 and had between them a wide and interesting variety of abilities. One boy named Thomas could read better than most adults Evelyn had known. 2 children could not yet identify all the letters of the alphabet. The rest were scattered across the full length of that range with no particular pattern. She taught them for 6 hours and went home and sat on the edge of her bed and held the back of her neck with both hands and stared at the floor. Her head ached. 2 of the younger children had spent the last hour of the day crying for different reasons. The soft spot in the floor had developed an alarming creak that she was choosing to ignore until Saturday. She thought about the letters from Gerald Hatch. She thought about her father at the station in Harrisburg, arms folded, jaw tight. She thought about Thomas, who read better than most adults she'd known, reading a passage from a battered geography book aloud with the particular concentration of someone doing something they loved more than they'd ever admitted to anyone. She lay back on the bed. Tomorrow she'd try it differently. Group the readers by level. Let Cecily take the youngest three. Fix the creak before someone put their foot through the floor. One thing at a time. Outside, the Wyoming night settled over Cedar Ridge, cold and clear and enormous. The stars doing what they always did out here, showing up in numbers that made everything seem both very small and very important at once. Evelyn Hart, 19 years old, 2 suitcases, $63, and 1 letter of intent, lay in her narrow bed in Martha Elwood's boarding house and thought about what came next. Not with fear. Not exactly. With the particular kind of concentration that comes when you've stopped wondering whether you can do something and started working out how. The floor joist got fixed on Saturday, as promised. Nathan showed up at 7 in the morning with timber already cut to length in the back of his wagon, and a younger man named Dill, who worked one of his hired positions, and said almost nothing but worked with an efficiency that suggested the silence was a feature, not a deficit. Evelyn unlocked the schoolhouse door and got out of the way, which was harder than it sounded because her instinct was to be useful, and there was nothing for her to be useful at while 2 men with more carpentry experience than her were doing carpentry. She cleaned the storage room instead. The raccoon smell was not as bad as it had been, which she decided to count as progress. She cleared out what was in there: a broken chair, a crate of old primers that turned out to be salvageable, if not exactly recent, a rusted coal scuttle, and enough mouse evidence that she went through the whole room with a mop afterward twice. By the time she was done, Nathan and Dill had the bad joist out and the new one in. And the soft spot in the floor was solid enough that Nathan stood on it several times with his full weight to demonstrate. "That'll hold," he said. "I can see that," she said. "Thank you." Dill picked up his tools and went outside to the wagon. Nathan stayed, which she noticed. "The windows," he said, looking at the 2 that were still boarded. "I know," she said. "I haven't been able to find glass in town." "Briggs at the general store can order it. Takes about 3 weeks. 3 weeks is a long time to teach with boards for windows." "It is," he agreed. He looked at the boards and then at her. "I might have something at the ranch, some pane glass from when I redid the bunkhouse windows last year. I don't know if it's the right size." "If it's close to the right size, I can make it work," she said. He looked at her with that expression she was getting familiar with, the slight recalibration, like she kept saying things that were a degree more certain than he'd prepared for. "I'll check tonight," he said. She nodded. He put his hat on. He went outside. She stood in the middle of the classroom, which smelled of fresh-cut timber and old primers and the ghost of raccoon, and she looked at what a week had produced. The floor was solid. The windows were mostly clean. The desks were in rows by size, smallest in front, a system Cecily had approved of with a single nod that served as high praise. The blackboard was as good as it was going to get, which was not as good as the one she'd used in Harrisburg, but was good enough to write on clearly. It was not much. It was also, incrementally, more than it had been. She pulled out her list and crossed off floor and storage room and wrote glass, Nathan, check, and primers, inventory, and thought about Monday with the specific combination of dread and determination that had started to feel like her baseline state. The second week of school was harder than the first in the ways that second weeks usually were. The novelty worn off, the reality setting in, the gap between what she'd planned and what was actually possible becoming clear and specific. Thomas, who read so well, had no patience for arithmetic and made this known through a kind of low-grade passive resistance that was more exhausting than open defiance would have been. He didn't argue, exactly. He just stared at the numbers on the board with an expression of courteous incomprehension that suggested the numbers might as well have been written in a language from another continent. "Thomas," she said on Tuesday afternoon, after the 3rd iteration of this, "I need you to actually try." "I am trying," he said. "You are performing trying," she said. "It's not the same thing." He blinked. Beside him, a girl named Polly covered her mouth with her hand to hide something that was probably a smile. "What's the difference?" Thomas asked. Performing trying looks like trying from the outside, but it doesn't actually engage with the problem, Evelyn said. Real trying involves actually thinking about the numbers and getting annoyed when they don't make sense. I am annoyed, Thomas said. That's a start, she said. Now point at the part that doesn't make sense. He pointed. It was, as she'd suspected, a foundational gap. He'd learned addition and subtraction in isolation, and no one had connected them to each other or to anything else. She spent 20 minutes with him after the other children had gone for the day and came to understand that his arithmetic problem was not a problem with arithmetic, but with the way it had been explained to him the first time, which was wrong enough that he'd built everything on top of the wrong foundation. That wasn't your fault, she told him, when they'd worked back far enough to find where the wrong turn had happened. I know, Thomas said, which was so unexpected that she almost laughed. Most children feel embarrassed when they don't understand something, she said. I don't see the point in that, he said. The thing doesn't make sense. That's just true. Being embarrassed about it doesn't help. She looked at him, 9 years old, skinny, with ink on his left hand that he apparently never fully washed off, and thought that Cedar Ridge had produced, in this particular child, something interesting. Come back Thursday morning at 7, she told him, before the others arrive. He came back Thursday at 6:45, which told her something else about him. October arrived while she wasn't paying attention. One day the mornings were merely cold, and the next they were the kind of cold that required her to break the ice in the basin before she could wash her face. She asked Martha about where to get a heavier coat, and Martha pointed her to the general store, where Briggs sold her a lined wool coat that had been made for a larger woman and required some adjustment but was warm in a way that her Pennsylvania coat was not. First winter? Briggs asked. First winter, she confirmed. The cold here, he said, wrapping her purchase, is a different kind of cold than back east. It doesn't just sit on the surface, it gets in. I'm beginning to understand that, she said. You'll want to lay in some extra wood, he said. If you're staying at Martha's, tell her I said she should check the supply. She always waits too long. She passed this on to Martha, who received it with the particular expression of someone who knew they'd been told something true and resented it. Extra wood was ordered. The schoolhouse stove became critical. She arrived every morning 30 minutes before the children to get it going, because a classroom full of cold children was a classroom that wasn't learning, and she'd worked out in the first week that the stove needed at least half an hour to make the room genuinely warm. She split her own kindling, which she'd had to learn by asking Cecily, who'd taught her without commentary beyond one correction of her grip on the axe. She and Cecily had developed a working relationship that she valued and was careful not to press too hard. Cecily did not respond well to effusiveness. She responded to being taken seriously, which was a different thing. Evelyn took her seriously and got in return a reliable, quietly competent presence in the classroom that was worth more than she could easily account for. Cecily knew which children were having trouble at home and which ones were bored and which ones were slower than the others, for reasons that had nothing to do with intelligence. She conveyed this information in the same brief, undecorated way she did everything, and Evelyn used it. Polly's mother has been sick, Cecily told her one morning, before the children arrived, in the flat tone of someone reporting a fact. She's been doing a lot of the cooking and the younger children at home. Evelyn looked at the grade records. Polly had missed 2 days the previous week. I'll check in with her today, she said. Don't make it obvious, Cecily said. I won't. Cecily looked at her for a moment, apparently decided she meant it, and went to start setting out the primers. Polly was 11 and smart and tired in a way that 11-year-olds mostly weren't, the tiredness sitting behind her eyes and making her a second slower than usual to respond. Evelyn waited for a moment at the end of the day when the other children had gone and said, without preamble, "You can take your reader home, if it helps." Polly looked at the reader, a battered but complete copy of a McGuffey's, and then up. "We only have the one," she said. "I'll make do," Evelyn said. "The younger ones can share." A pause. "I'm sorry I missed Tuesday and Wednesday." "You don't need to apologize," Evelyn said. "Just keep up when you can." "My mother—" "I know," Evelyn said simply. "Take the book." Polly took it. Her face didn't do anything dramatic. She was a contained child, not given to displays. But something in her shoulders shifted. She left, and Evelyn stood in the classroom by herself for a moment, and thought about what she knew and didn't know about the lives of the children she was responsible for. You could stand in front of them every day and teach and still miss the whole shape of what was happening. The trick was to keep looking at the shape, not just the surface. The letter from her father came in the 3rd week of October. She'd written him twice since arriving. Functional letters, informative. The kind that said, "I am here and I am managing," without inviting commentary. His letter back was 3 pages, which was more than he'd written her in the entire year before she'd left. The first page was what she'd expected. Questions about safety, questions about accommodation, a comment about the wisdom of young women traveling to frontier territories alone that stopped just short of saying, "I told you so," but only just. She read it with the patience she'd developed for him over the years, which was a kind of patience that required her to hold the affection and the frustration in the same hand simultaneously. The second page surprised her. He wrote about her mother, not in the oblique way he usually managed the subject, the way that kept it at a distance and made it safe to handle, but directly. A specific memory of her mother teaching Evelyn to read, sitting at the kitchen table in the house on Mercer Street, the patience her mother had had, and the way young Evelyn had asked questions that circled back on themselves until she'd arrived at the answer herself. He wrote that he thought Evelyn's mother would have understood what she was doing in Wyoming, even if he wasn't sure he did. She read that paragraph 3 times. The third page was her father being her father again. Practical concerns, a small amount of money enclosed, a question about whether she needed anything sent from Harrisburg. The emotional moment had passed and he'd moved on from it in the way he always did. Like a man who'd opened a window briefly and then closed it before the cold could get in. She folded the letter and put it in her coat pocket and sat on the edge of her bed in the narrow room at Martha Elwood's boarding house and thought about her mother at the kitchen table on Mercer Street. The patience, the way she'd waited. She wrote back that evening. 4 pages, longer than she'd intended. She told him about the schoolhouse and Thomas and the raccoons and Gerald Hatch moving to Denver. She told him about Cecily Dunmore. She told him about Nathan Reed and the lumber and the glass panes, which had turned out to be close enough to the right size that she'd managed them, and the windows were windows again. She did not tell him about the night by the road, sleeping against her suitcase. She would tell him eventually. Not yet. Nathan Reed came by the schoolhouse on a Thursday evening in mid-October, not for any particular reason he named, but she'd noticed by then that he had a habit of stopping in when he was passing through town, which was more often than a man whose ranch was 2 miles north of Cedar Ridge strictly needed to pass through. She'd also noticed that she didn't mind. He was not easy to talk to, in the way that some people weren't because they were unforthcoming, but that wasn't quite it. He was more like a man who'd decided that words should mean something when they were used and didn't see the point in using them when they didn't. Once she'd understood that, conversation with him had a particular quality she found restful. Nothing wasted, nothing performative, the things that got said being the things that actually needed saying. She'd been marking the children's writing exercises when he appeared in the doorway. She looked up. "I'm not bothering you," he said. "You're not," she said. "Come in." He came in and looked at the classroom in the way he sometimes did. Taking inventory, she'd decided, checking that the things he'd fixed were holding. The floor, the windows. He'd also, without being asked, rehung the door so it no longer required her full weight to open, and she hadn't mentioned this because it seemed like something he'd done and didn't want remarked upon. "How are they doing?" he asked, nodding at the stack of writing exercises. "Better than last week," she said. "Thomas is still avoiding arithmetic when he can, but he's avoiding it in smaller ways." "Progress," Nathan said. "Incremental," she agreed. He pulled out one of the adult-sized chairs from the back. She'd acquired 2 for parent visits, and sat in it with the slight awkwardness of a large man in a school chair. She noticed he didn't ask permission to sit, which she counted in his favor. People who asked permission to sit in rooms they were already in sometimes annoyed her. "Roy Alderman's been talking about pulling his boy out," he said. "Jim, the youngest, 7 years old." She put her pen down. "Why?" "Roy thinks the boy's needed at home. Extra hands." "Jim is 7, she said. "Roy's practical," Nathan said. "More than he is far-sighted sometimes." She thought about Jim Alderman, who was 7 and small for it, and had a habit of pressing his mouth together when he was concentrating that made him look like a very serious old man. He was at the beginning stage of reading, that place where the letters were just starting to resolve into words, and it was important that he not lose the ground he'd gained. "Can you talk to Roy?" she asked. Nathan looked at her. "I can," he said. "What do you want me to say?" "That a boy who can read is worth more to a ranch in 10 years than a boy who can't in one." She paused. "And that Jim is at a critical stage and pulling him out now specifically would be a waste of the time he's already put in." Nathan considered this. "Roy responds better to practical arguments than moral ones," he said. "I'm making a practical argument," she said. "You are," he agreed. He looked at her for a moment. "You've figured out how to talk to people here pretty fast." "I figured out how to listen," she said. "That's different." "Most people think they're the same thing." "Most people are wrong," she said. He looked at her for another moment in that way she'd gotten used to. The recalibration, the slight adjustment in the estimate. She'd stopped finding it unsettling. She'd started finding it, if she was honest, something closer to the opposite of that. "I'll talk to Roy," he said. Jim Alderman stayed in school. He was there the following Monday with the same serious, concentrated expression and the same press of his mouth when the letters were being difficult, and Evelyn watched him work through a primer page with the particular attentiveness of someone who understood what it had cost to keep him there. Roy Alderman came to the school Thursday afternoon, at the end of the day when the children had gone. He was a thick-set man with the outdoor weathering of someone who worked land hard, and he stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and the look of a man who wanted to say something and wasn't sure of the protocol. "Mr. Alderman," she said, "come in." He came in and stood just inside the door. "Nathan said you wanted to keep Jim in school," he said. "I think it's worth it," she said. "Jim's at the stage where he's about to break through. If he loses momentum now, it'll take him longer to get back to where he is than the time he'd save doing chores." Roy Alderman turned his hat in his hands. He's not a stupid boy," he said, in the tone of someone clarifying something that mattered to them. "No," she said. "He's not at all. He's careful. He doesn't like to get things wrong, so he thinks before he answers. That looks slow, but it's not the same as slow." Something shifted in Roy Alderman's face. "His mother said the same thing," he said quietly. "Before she—" He stopped. Evelyn waited. "She passed 2 winters back," he said. "Jim doesn't talk about it." "He doesn't need to," she said. Roy turned his hat around once more and then stopped. "All right," he said. "He'll stay." After he left, she sat in the empty classroom for a while and thought about the gap between what people showed and what they were carrying. Roy Alderman and his hat and his practical arguments, and underneath that a man whose wife had been gone for 2 winters and whose youngest son pressed his mouth tight when he was trying to get things right. You could stand in front of a community for years and still not see all the way into it. The seeing took time. Well, October went, the way October went in Wyoming. It took everything it had given and methodically took it back. The colors went first, the brief yellow of the cottonwoods along the creek bleaching out into a bare gray that matched the sky. Then the ground, which had been merely hard, got the kind of hardness that didn't give under your boot at all, like walking on iron. The cold that Briggs had warned her about, the kind that got in, arrived without announcement one morning when she walked to the schoolhouse and felt it reach through her new wool coat like her coat was not there. She went back to Martha Elwood's boarding house and put on another layer and went back. "You'll toughen up," Martha told her when she mentioned the cold over supper. "I don't want to toughen up," Evelyn said. "I want to be warm." "Same thing eventually," Martha said. "That seems like a pessimistic view of warmth," Evelyn said. Martha pointed her fork at her. "You're a funny one," she said, which was apparently a compliment because she looked satisfied after she said it. The boarders at Martha's had shifted by then. Chet at the livery was still there, steady as furniture, and Rosalie had gone back to her sister's house. And in her place there was a young man named Peter who was clerking at the hardware and was sufficiently miserable about being in Wyoming that his misery had a kind of entertainment value at the supper table. Evelyn found him useful in the way that a clear example of something is useful. She could look at how unhappy Peter was in Cedar Ridge and understand, by contrast, what she felt, which was not happy exactly, but was something more complicated and more durable. She belonged somewhere that challenged her. She'd known it in an abstract way in Harrisburg, stacking books in the school where she'd been helping and watching the teacher in front of the room and thinking I could do that. I should be doing that with a conviction that had no outlet. Here it had an outlet. The outlet was cold and exhausting, and sometimes the floor smelled like raccoon, and sometimes she lay in bed at night and stared at the ceiling, wondering if she was doing any of this right. But it was real. It was hers. The trouble with the Peterson family came in the last week of October. Margaret Peterson was 8 years old and had been attending school since the first day, reliable and quiet, with the kind of politeness that sometimes hid things, and sometimes was just politeness. She'd been doing well, reading at grade level, keeping up in arithmetic with the solid, if unexcited competence of a child who understood that school was something you did whether or not you liked it. She stopped coming. After 3 days, Evelyn asked Cecily, who knew everything about the families in Cedar Ridge in the way that perceptive 15-year-olds who had lived in the same place all their lives knew things. Cecily was quiet for a moment. Her father, she said, he doesn't think girls need schooling past a certain point. Evelyn sat with this. And where's Margaret's mother in all this? Mrs. Peterson agrees with Mr. Peterson, Cecily said, in a tone that suggested she found this baffling but had run out of ways to be baffled by it. What's the certain point? Evelyn asked. 8, apparently, Cecily said. 8. Evelyn thought about Margaret Peterson's careful penmanship and the way she'd quietly help the younger children when she finished her own work, not making a show of it, just doing it because it needed doing. I'm going to talk to them, she said. Cecily looked at her. Mr. Peterson isn't... I know, Evelyn said. I'm going to talk to them anyway. She went on Saturday afternoon. The Peterson farm was a mile and a half east of town, and she walked it, which gave her time to think about what she was going to say and how she was going to say it. She'd learned some things about Cedar Ridge in the weeks since she'd arrived, which arguments worked and which didn't, who needed to be approached directly and who needed to be approached sideways. She didn't know Hank Peterson well enough to be sure which kind he was. He turned out to be the sideways kind. She sat in the Peterson kitchen with a cup of coffee she hadn't asked for, but that Mrs. Peterson had produced with the reflexive hospitality of someone for whom hospitality was armor, and she talked about Margaret. She talked about what Margaret could do and how quickly she was learning. She talked about practical things. But reading meant Margaret could help with household accounts. Arithmetic meant she could price a sale correctly. Writing meant she could communicate when verbal communication wasn't possible. She didn't talk about what she actually thought, which was that Margaret Peterson had a mind that deserved to be used, and that keeping her home at 8 years old to do chores was a waste that would cost Margaret more than anyone else. Hank Peterson listened. He was not a cruel man. She could see that, even through the stubbornness. He was a man who decided things a certain way and couldn't find a path to undeciding them without it feeling like defeat. It's one more winter, she said at the end. Let her finish this school year. She's this far along, it would be a shame to stop now. Mrs. Peterson, who had been mostly quiet, looked at her husband. One more winter, he said. One more winter, she agreed. He said nothing for a moment that stretched out long enough that she wasn't sure which way it would go. Then he nodded, just once. All right, he said. She'll come back Monday. She walked back to Cedar Ridge in the cold with the particular satisfaction of a thing done that had needed doing, without illusion that it was done permanently. One more winter. She'd work with that. She told Nathan about it on Thursday evening when he stopped in at the schoolhouse again. She'd fallen into the habit of telling him things she'd noticed, the small accounts of the week, the obstacles, the incremental victories. He listened without offering opinions she hadn't asked for, which was not nothing. Hank Peterson, he said. He said one more winter, she said. I'll take it. Most people wouldn't have gone out there, he said. What would most people have done? Waited, he said. Hoped she'd come back on her own. Hoping doesn't move things, she said. Going moves things. He looked at her. She was aware in the moment of the particular quality of his attention, the way he looked at things when he was actually looking, not just seeing. She'd noticed it first with the horses, and then with the land, and then a little later with her. You grew up being told no a lot, he said. It wasn't quite a question. She considered this. My father had a sense of what was appropriate for a young woman, and a young woman's education, and young women in general. He meant well. But? But his sense was wrong, she said, in the particular way that men's sense often is, not out of malice, just out of not having been corrected. Nathan looked at his hands. I've probably done that, he said. Had the wrong sense about things. Probably, she said, without cruelty. And you tell me if you thought I was wrong about something, he said. I'd consider it, she said, depending on the something. He looked up at her then, and there was something in the look, not amusement exactly, but its close relative, and something else underneath that she wasn't naming yet. She held the look for a moment and then went back to her marking, because there was a time for naming things and a time for letting them be unnameable, and she was better than most people at knowing the difference. He stayed another half an hour. They talked about the winter, the real winter, the one everyone was describing in terms that suggested it was a different category of cold entirely from what she'd experienced so far. She asked questions. He answered them without exaggeration and without the theater some people brought to describing the harshness of frontier life, like harshness was something to be proud of rather than managed. When he left, she sat in the quiet schoolhouse after and thought about his face when he'd said, I've probably done that. The willingness in it. Not self-flagellation, not performance. Just a man considering the possibility that he'd been wrong about things and not finding that possibility catastrophic. She thought that was worth something. In her experience, that particular capacity was rarer than people gave it credit for. Outside, the wind had picked up, and through the fixed windows, solid in their frames now, doing what windows were supposed to do, she could see the first scatter of snow coming down, light and preliminary, the territory's way of announcing what was coming. She watched it for a while, then blew out the lamp and locked the door and walked back through the cold to Martha Elwood's boarding house, where supper would be on and Peter the clerk would be complaining about something. And the ordinary evening would be there waiting for her like it always was. She walked through the snow that was not yet enough to cover the ground, just enough to make the air smell of something clean and coming, and she thought about what it would be like. This place, this winter, these children, this life she was still in the process of choosing, and she didn't find the answer frightening. Complicated, yes. Unresolved, certainly, but not frightening. That felt like its own kind of progress. The snow that had come down light and preliminary in late October turned serious in November. It came in the way Briggs had predicted and Nathan had described, and everyone in Cedar Ridge seemed to have a story about, not gradually, not with warning enough to be useful, but in the manner of something that had been patient for a long time and had simply decided it was done being patient. Evelyn woke one morning in the second week of November to a world that had been rearranged overnight. The familiar shapes of Main Street softened into something almost unrecognizable. The cold outside her window a different category of cold from anything she'd previously understood cold to be. She put on every layer she owned and went to light the schoolhouse stove. The children came anyway, most of them. Jim Alderman was there, and Thomas, and Margaret Peterson, who had returned on the Monday after Evelyn's visit to the farm and had been quietly, steadily present ever since. 8 out of 12 made it through the snow, which was enough. She taught with her coat on until the room warmed and spent the afternoon showing the older children how to calculate the area of irregular shapes using a method she'd adapted from a geometry primer. Because she'd found that Thomas engaged with arithmetic when it was attached to something spatial and could be drawn rather than just numbered. By 3 o'clock, the snow had stopped and the sky had gone that hard, clear blue that Wyoming apparently produced after storms, a blue so definite it looked painted. She sent the children home in pairs, making sure the younger ones were with older ones, and stood in the doorway watching them go until the last pair turned the corner onto Main Street. That was November. That was how November went. The storms arriving and the children coming anyway, and Evelyn learning, week by week, what this winter was actually made of. Nathan's visits to the schoolhouse had become, by November, a thing that didn't need explaining. He came by on Thursday evenings when he was in town, and sometimes on Saturday mornings when he had business at the hardware, and occasionally on other days with no particular stated reason. He brought firewood once without mentioning it, just stacked it against the side of the building and said nothing. And she thanked him, and he nodded, and that was the whole transaction. Martha Elwood, who noticed everything and commented on most of it, had said nothing about Nathan's visits directly, which Evelyn had decided was its own kind of commentary. Martha's silences were as legible as her speech, once you'd lived at her table for a few weeks. He doesn't come into town this much usually, Cicely said one Thursday morning, with the directness of someone who had decided that pointing out a thing was more efficient than not pointing it out. "He has errands," Evelyn said. Cecily looked at her. "He had errands once a week in summer too," she said. "He's been in town 3 times this week." Evelyn made a notation in the gradebook that required no notation. "Margaret's reading level," she said, changing the subject without the pretense of subtlety. Cecily allowed the change with the expression of someone deciding to be merciful. "She's ready for the next primer," she said. She was right, and they moved on, and the Nathan question sat where it sat, unnamed and present, the way certain things did when you were not quite ready to name them and not quite able to pretend they weren't there. She understood something about Nathan Reed by November that she hadn't understood in September. He was a man who'd had something taken from him. She didn't know what, specifically. He hadn't told her, and she hadn't asked, because that wasn't the kind of knowing you pressed for. It was the kind that came in its own time, or didn't come. But she could see the shape of the absence in the way he talked about his ranch. "I've got 2 hired hands, some cattle, that's about it." And the way he didn't talk about anything before his arrival in Wyoming, and the way he sometimes looked at things with a distance that had nothing to do with where his eyes were pointed. Whatever he'd lost, he'd responded by building something solid and manageable. The ranch was real. The timber was real. The work of his hands on the schoolhouse floor was real. He'd learned, she suspected, to trust what he could touch and be cautious about everything else. She understood this more than she'd have liked to, because it was not entirely different from what she'd done herself in the 2 years since her mother died. Build the list. Deal with the pieces. Keep moving. Don't stand still long enough to feel the whole weight of the thing. The difference was that she knew she was doing it. She wasn't sure he did. This was not a thought she'd have had in September. In September, she hadn't known him well enough to think about what he knew about himself. But November was a different country from September, in Wyoming and otherwise. The blizzard came on a Friday. She knew it was coming because the sky on Thursday had a particular color at the horizon that Nathan had pointed out to her a week earlier, a yellowish gray, he'd said, that meant the serious weather was building. She'd noticed it Thursday afternoon on her way home from the schoolhouse, and felt a preemptive cold go through her that had nothing to do with the temperature. Friday morning, the children came to school, and she made a decision by 10 o'clock that she would send them home early. The sky had gone completely to that yellow-gray, and the wind had the quality that preceded a real storm, not blowing in a direction so much as moving in all directions at once, searching. "Everyone go straight home," she told them. She looked at Jim Alderman. "Jim, your father is in town today?" "He came in this morning," Jim said. "He's at the hardware. Go find him before you go home," she said. She sent them out in the same pairs she always used, older with younger, the ones with farther to go leaving first. She stood in the doorway and watched them disperse, and then she went back inside and made sure the stove was properly banked, and the door was latched, and the firewood stacked inside was enough to last. She meant to go straight back to Martha's. She had every intention of going straight back to Martha's. What happened was that she remembered the primers. She'd borrowed 4 of them from the storage room at the back of the hardware. Briggs had a collection of old-school materials from some previous attempt at education in Cedar Ridge, before her time, and she'd meant to return them before the weather turned because they weren't hers, and she didn't want to be responsible for them over a hard winter. She had them in a stack on her desk, ready to go back. She'd been planning to return them Thursday, and had forgotten, and now. It was 6 blocks to the hardware. The snow hadn't started yet, just the wind in the sky. She could go and come back in 15 minutes. She went. The snow started before she reached the hardware, not gently. The first flakes were large and fast and horizontal, driven by a wind that had apparently been waiting for permission and was now making up for lost time. She had her wool coat and a scarf around her head and her good boots, and these things were adequate for the weather she'd been walking in all month. But what hit her in the 4 blocks between the schoolhouse and the hardware was not that weather. It was a different order of thing. She made it to the hardware. Briggs was shuttering his windows, working fast, and looked at her when she pushed through the door with the expression of a man who had been expecting sensible people to be inside and was surprised by her. "Books," she said, putting the stack on his counter. "I was returning these." "You walked here in this?" he said. "It hadn't started when I left," she said, which was true and also slightly optimistic in retrospect. Through the window she could see Main Street disappearing. That was the only word for it. The familiar buildings were still there, but the space between them was filling with white and moving. The whole familiar street becoming something that had to be negotiated rather than assumed. "You can't go back in that," Briggs said. "Martha's is 4 blocks, she said. 4 blocks in a whiteout is not 4 blocks, he said. He was not the kind of man who exaggerated things for emphasis, which made the flatness of this statement more alarming than a more dramatic version would have been. "Stay here. I've got a stove in the back room." She thought about Martha's boarding house and the supper that would be on, and Martha not knowing where she was, and then she thought about the view through the hardware window and made herself look at it honestly. The space between the hardware and the next building was already a gray-white approximation of what it had been. She could see perhaps 30 feet. "I need to let someone know where I am," she said. "I'll send word when someone comes in," Briggs said. "Stay in the back room. I'll get the stove going." She stayed. She sat in the back room of the hardware with a stove that Briggs got going in 10 minutes and a blanket from somewhere in the back, and she listened to the storm outside and thought about the children, whether they'd all made it home, whether Jim had found his father at the hardware before his father had left, whether Margaret Peterson had the 1.5 miles back to the farm in her, and whether she'd been smart enough to find shelter if she didn't. She couldn't do anything about any of it from the back room of the hardware. This was the worst part of responsibility. The moments when the people you were responsible for were outside your reach, and the only thing left to do was trust that you'd prepared them well enough. Nathan Reed heard about it from Dill, who'd come into town that morning for feed and was at the livery when the storm hit and was therefore dry and warm and able to tell Nathan, when Nathan arrived at the livery looking for Cassidy, that Miss Hart had been seen going toward the hardware half an hour before the whiteout. "Half an hour ago," Nathan said. "About that," Dill said. Nathan looked at the livery door beyond which the storm was doing what it was doing. He thought about the half hour and the hardware and the 4 blocks between and whether someone who'd arrived in Wyoming 6 weeks ago understood what a Wyoming whiteout meant about distances. He went out. Dill said something behind him, something that was probably the word crazy or a close relative, and Nathan pulled his coat up around his ears and went into the storm. He'd been in whiteouts before. He'd been in worse than this, technically, though the technicality of it didn't feel significant at the moment. What you did in a whiteout was the same as what you did in any situation where vision was removed. You slowed down, you kept track of what you knew, you moved toward the thing you were moving toward without losing track of where you'd started. He knew where the hardware was from the livery. He knew the distance and he knew the angle, and he moved through the white noise of the storm with his head down and his hands occasionally reaching for a wall or a post to confirm his position. He found the hardware because the hardware was where he expected it to be, which was how direction-keeping worked when it worked. Briggs opened the door before he knocked. "She's in the back," Briggs said. She looked up when Nathan came through the door of the back room, and she could tell from his face and from the state of his coat, white from the shoulders up, ice crystals on his eyebrows, something in his expression that wasn't quite its usual flatness, that the walk from the livery had been something. "You came out in that," she said. "Yep," he said. "That was—" She stopped. She'd been going to say unnecessary and then reconsidered, because the word was technically true and also wrong in a way she couldn't precisely articulate. She'd been sitting in the back room for what felt like an hour, worrying about the children, and about whether Martha knew where she was. And the fact of Nathan Reed coming through a blizzard to check on her was doing something to the equilibrium she tried to maintain, and she needed a moment to let it settle. "Sit down," she said instead. "You're covered in snow." He sat. He pulled off his coat and a cloud of melted snow steam rose from his shoulders in the warmth of the room. He ran a hand over his face. "The children," she said. "Jim Alderman. Did you see him at the livery?" "His father had him," Nathan said. "They came in before it hit. Everyone's accounted for, far as I know. Cecily Dunmore's family lives close to the school. She'd have gone there." She let out a breath that had been in her chest for the better part of an hour. "Right," she said. "Good." He looked at her. She looked at him. The stove popped and settled. "You went back for the books," he said. "It was not a question. I meant to return them Thursday," she said. "I forgot. Evelyn." He said her name in a tone she hadn't heard from him before. Not a reprimand, not quite, but the tone of someone who had something to say and was weighing whether to say it. "I know," she said. "The timing was poor." Poor, he said. Very poor, she allowed. He looked at the wall for a moment. She could see him deciding something. When he looked back, his expression had the quality of a man who'd made a decision and was committed to it for better or worse. You're going to keep doing things like this, he said. Probably, she said. Going out when you shouldn't, walking into situations unprepared. I was prepared, she said. The situation changed faster than my preparation accounted for. That's the same thing, he said. It isn't, she said. There's a difference between being unprepared and being caught by circumstances. I was caught by circumstances. I'll adapt. He looked at her for a long moment. You always have an answer, he said. I usually have an answer, she said. Whether it's the right answer is a separate question. Something shifted in his expression then. Not softening exactly, because Nathan Reed's face didn't soften in the way other people's did, but something behind it changing, some adjustment in the thing underneath. He looked at her in a way that was different from the recalibration she'd gotten used to, more direct than those, less analytical. I didn't know where you were, he said. When Dill told me you'd gone toward the hardware before the whiteout. She held the look. I'm all right, she said. I know you are, he said. I can see that. Then, I didn't know that when I was walking through the storm, he said. That's what I'm telling you. The stove popped again. Outside, the wind was doing something considerable to the eaves of the building, a low, sustained sound that had a kind of authority to it. She understood what he was telling her. She understood it clearly enough that her chest did something she hadn't asked it to do, a tightening that wasn't unpleasant. Nathan, she said, and then stopped, because what she'd been going to say was complicated, and she wasn't sure the back room of the hardware in a blizzard was where she wanted to say it. You don't have to say anything, he said. I know I don't, she said. I was going to say that I'm glad you came, not because I needed to be rescued, but because... She stopped again and this time took a moment and found the words that were actually true rather than the first ones that had come. Because it meant something that you walked out in that, she said, and I'm not going to pretend it didn't. He looked at her. Something settled in his face that hadn't been settled before. All right, he said. Just that. But with a weight in it that meant more than the two words. But they were in the back room of the hardware for 3 hours. Briggs brought them coffee and then left them alone, the discretion of a practical man who understood when a space needed to be vacated. The storm outside held at full intensity for the first 2 hours, and then, in the third, shifted. The wind dropping to something that still moved but no longer howled, the sound changing from the sustained roar to a quieter ongoing business. They talked. That was what happened over those 3 hours. They talked in the way that people talked when circumstances had removed the option of keeping things at a comfortable distance. She told him about her father's letter and the memory of her mother at the kitchen table with the reading primer. He was quiet for a moment after she told him that, and she didn't rush him. My father wasn't a patient man, he said. He taught me things by doing them wrong first and explaining what he'd done wrong after. It wasn't a kind way to learn things. But you learned them, she said. I learned to pay attention, he said, because not paying attention meant making the same mistake he'd already made, and I didn't want to make those. She thought about what that meant for a child, learning caution as a survival mechanism rather than as a considered approach. Is that why you moved out here? She asked. To Wyoming? He looked at the stove for a moment. Partly, he said. There was a woman back in Missouri. We were going to be married. A pause. She decided she didn't want the life I was going to give her, which turned out to be the right call, probably. We weren't... He stopped and started again. I thought I knew what I wanted, and I didn't. Not really. The ranch out here was the first thing I built that felt like mine. Not ours, not my father's. Mine. She listened to the way he said mine, not with possessiveness, more with the particular relief of a man who'd found solid ground after a long time without it. Is it enough? She asked. She meant it as a practical question. It came out as something more. He looked at her. It was, he said, for a while. The wind shifted outside, quieter now, and in the quiet, the stove's warmth seemed more present. I'm not an easy person, she said. I should probably tell you that directly rather than letting you figure it out on your own. I figured it out, he said. You argue about things that don't need arguing about, and you walk into blizzards over borrowed books and you have an opinion about everything." "Yes," she said. "I'm not saying those are bad things," he said. "I know," she said. "I wasn't apologizing. I was being accurate." He looked at her with that expression she'd never quite been able to name. Not the recalibration, something different from that, something that had been building through all the Thursday evenings and the lumber and the fixed door that swung right, and the sign that no longer read CEARRIDGSCHL. "Evelyn," he said. "Nathan," she said. Outside, Cedar Ridge sat under its blanket of new snow, the storm passing over and moving east, the sky beginning to clear at the edges in the way Wyoming skies did after they'd said what they needed to say. The cold was still serious. The walk back to Martha Elwood's boarding house, when they finally made it, was not comfortable. But she made it with Nathan Reed walking beside her through the settling snow, and the 4 blocks from the hardware to the boarding house felt different from how 4 blocks usually felt. More deliberate, more considered, like ground that meant something by virtue of being walked on together. He didn't say anything else on the walk. He didn't need to. Some things got said in a blizzard's back room and stayed said, operating quietly underneath everything that came after, changing the shape of the space between two people without requiring further ceremony. At the door of the boarding house, he stopped. She stopped. "Saturday?" he said. "Saturday," she agreed, which wasn't a word for a day of the week so much as an agreement about what kind of thing they were in now that they hadn't been in before. She went inside. Martha was at the stove and looked at her with the expression of someone who had been worried and was converting the worry rapidly into something more manageable. "You're all right," Martha said. "I'm all right," Evelyn said. "The children, everyone home safe," she said. Briggs had word. Martha looked at her for a moment longer than the situation strictly required, in the way of a woman who saw more than she commented on and was filing what she saw away for later. Then she turned back to the stove. "Supper in 20 minutes, she said. "Go get dry." Evelyn went upstairs. She sat on the edge of her bed and took off her boots, which were wet all the way through, and held them in her hands for a moment. From the window, she could see the end of Main Street where the light was coming back into the sky. That particular post-storm clarity, the world scrubbed clean and very cold and very precise. She thought about Nathan saying, "I didn't know that when I was walking through the storm in the flat, honest way he said things when he was being honest rather than careful." She thought about the 3 hours in the back room of the hardware and what had been said, and what had been understood without being said. She set her boots by the door to dry and went to change into dry clothes, moving through the small room with the particular lightness of someone who has put something down that they hadn't known they were still carrying. Not the fear of being alone, exactly, not that simple, but something close to it, something adjacent to it that had its own weight and had been sitting there unacknowledged since September, since the night by the road, since she'd looked up at Nathan Reed's lantern coming through the dark, and decided that whatever came next was probably better than what she'd been doing alone. That had been practical then. Now it was something different, and she was honest enough with herself to name it, at least in the quiet of her own room where the naming didn't require anything of her yet. She named it. Then she went back downstairs for supper. The Saturday after the blizzard, Nathan came to the schoolhouse at 7 in the morning with a pot of coffee and no explanation. She was already there. She was always there before 7. It was just how the days worked now. And she'd been reviewing the arithmetic exercises from the previous week when she heard boots on the step and looked up to find him in the doorway with the pot and 2 tin cups and the particular expression of a man who has decided something and is executing on it without overthinking. "Coffee," he said. "I can see that," she said. He came in and poured, and they sat at 2 of the large chairs she kept at the back for parent visits. And the coffee was strong in the way Nathan made coffee, which was the way she'd come to prefer it. Outside, the world was still entirely white, the post-blizzard landscape showing no signs of negotiating with the cold. The schoolhouse stove was going, and the room was warm, and the whole morning had a quality she didn't try to name. Something settled, something new in its settlings, the way the ground looked different after a real storm had moved through it. They didn't talk about what had been said in the back room of the hardware. That was done, and they both knew it was done, and neither of them were people who saw the point in revisiting things that had been fully said. What they talked about instead was everything else, the children, the winter, the question of whether Walt Dunmore was going to follow through on his suggestion of a school expansion in the spring. Nathan thought he would, given the right encouragement, by which he meant given the right pressure, by which he meant given Evelyn, and he said this with a neutrality that was its own kind of compliment. "You push things along," he said. "Things need pushing," she said. "Not everyone would," he said. "Not everyone notices when they do," she said, and he looked at her in that settled way and drank his coffee and said nothing more, which was itself a kind of sentence. She noticed that morning the way the light came through the repaired windows, the glass Nathan had found at the ranch, cut close enough and set firmly, and fell across the rows of desks with the particular clarity of winter light, which had a quality of honesty that summer light didn't. Everything looked like what it was in winter. There was no softening. She found she preferred it. December arrived, and with it a quiet shift in the way Cedar Ridge related to Evelyn Hart. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't the kind of thing that had a specific day attached to it. It was more like the way your eyes adjusted to a room after you'd been in it long enough. Not a moment of seeing, but a gradual accommodation, until one day you looked around and the room was simply familiar. She noticed it first with the mothers. There were 5 of them who came by the school with any regularity, bringing forgotten lunches, picking up younger children, the ordinary traffic of parents around a school. And in September, they had been polite to her in the way that people were polite to newcomers they were still deciding about. Courteous, but not warm. Interested, but not invested. By December, they were telling her things. Not big things, not confessions. Small things, the currency of actual community, Mrs. Alderman's sister was coming from Ohio in January. The Dunmores were thinking of adding a room to their house. Polly's mother was better, the illness having run its course, and Polly had come back to school full-time with a relief in her face that Evelyn had noted and not remarked upon. The children were a separate accounting. Thomas had broken through on arithmetic in a way she hadn't entirely seen coming. Not gradually, but suddenly, the way some learning worked, weeks of apparent plateau, and then one morning he sat down with a page of problems and worked through them with an ease that hadn't been there the day before. He looked up when he finished and found her watching, and the expression on his face was one she intended to remember, pure, uncomplicated satisfaction. The look of someone who has wanted something for a long time and has just gotten it. "You did that," she told him. "You showed me the part that was wrong," he said. "I showed you where to look," she said. "You did the fixing." He considered this distinction with the serious attention he gave to things that required serious attention. "All right," he said, and went back to the next problem. Jim Alderman was reading. Not fluently, not yet, but the letters had resolved into words, and the words had begun to link themselves into meaning. And she'd seen the moment it happened, the specific afternoon in mid-November when he'd read a full sentence aloud, and then looked up with the expression of someone who had just been told something that changed the shape of things. She'd said nothing. Sometimes the right response to a breakthrough was silence, a space for the thing to be real. Cecily Dunmore was harder to assess because Cecily resisted assessment, but Evelyn had watched her, over the months, change in small ways that amounted to something large. She stayed later in the afternoons. She asked questions that went past the primer material into the territory of genuine intellectual curiosity. She'd started writing, not assignments, her own writing, in a small notebook she kept in her coat pocket and produced when she thought no one was looking, though Evelyn always was. She didn't ask about the notebook. She waited. On a Tuesday afternoon in the second week of December, Cecily stayed after the other children had gone and stood near the door with her coat on, the posture of someone not yet decided about whether they were staying or leaving, and said, without preamble, "I want to be a teacher." Evelyn was erasing the board. She finished the section she was on before she turned around. "I know," she said. Cecily's expression shifted. "You know. You've been running a reading group for months and staying late every day, and you ask questions that aren't about what we're studying. They're about how to teach what we're studying." Evelyn set down the eraser. "It's not a subtle inclination." Cecily looked at the floor and then back up, and something in her face had the quality of something set down, the particular relief of a thing admitted. "My father thinks there's no point in me going further than I've already gone," she said. He's not cruel about it. He just doesn't see the need." "I know Walt Dunmore," Evelyn said. "Would you like me to talk to him, or would you rather I didn't?" Cecily thought about it. really thought. The genuine consideration, not the reflexive response. "Not yet," she said. "Let me try first." "All right," Evelyn said. "But the offer stands." "I know," Cicely said. She pulled her coat tighter. "You went out to the Peterson farm for Margaret." "I did." "You'd do the same for me," Cicely said. It wasn't quite a question, and it wasn't quite a statement. It was somewhere between the two, someone testing a thing they thought they knew. "Yes," Evelyn said simply. "I would." Cicely nodded once, the way she acknowledged things that mattered and didn't want to make a performance of. She went out into the December cold, and Evelyn stood in the empty schoolhouse and thought about what it cost a 15-year-old girl to say, "I want," in a place that had already decided what she should want, and what it meant that she'd said it anyway. Nathan had a difficult December. She knew this not because he told her, he didn't, not directly, but because she had become, over the months, someone who could read the particular frequencies of his silences. There were his ordinary silences, which were simply the absence of words when words weren't needed, comfortable and containing nothing alarming. And then there were the other kind, the ones with something underneath them. The second week of December, he came by the schoolhouse on a Thursday with the second kind of silence, and she let it be there for the first part of the evening, and then she said, "What happened?" He looked at her. "Lost a calf," he said. "Third one this winter." "I'm sorry," she said. "It happens," he said. "Happens every year, some years worse than others. Dill says the breeding pair in the south pasture might not make it to spring." "Is it the cold?" "Partly. Partly it's that the south pasture drainage is wrong and the ground stays wet longer than it should, and wet cold is worse than dry cold for livestock." He looked at his hands. "I should have fixed it last summer. I knew it needed fixing." She was quiet for a moment. "You can't fix everything in one season," she said. "No," he agreed. "But you can fix the things you know are wrong." She recognized this. The particular self-criticism of a capable person confronting the gap between what they'd known they should do and what they'd gotten to. She'd felt it herself, in the early weeks about the schoolhouse, about the things she'd known needed fixing and had dealt with in order of urgency, which meant some things waited longer than she'd wanted. "Will the drainage hold till spring?" she asked. "Probably," he said. "And in spring I'll fix it." "So you know what the problem is, and you know what the solution is, and you know when you can implement it," she said. "That's not failure. That's a plan." He looked at her with a directness she'd gotten used to but never entirely stopped noticing. "You make things simple," he said. "I make things accurate," she said. "There's a difference." "You say that about a lot of things," he said. "There's a difference." "Because there usually is," she said. The corner of his mouth moved in the way that served as a smile when he was being economical about it. She'd cataloged this expression without meaning to. It appeared when something she said caught him somewhere he hadn't expected to be caught. They sat for a while in the warm classroom while the December dark came down outside, the kind of comfortable quiet that required both people to have earned it. And Evelyn thought about what it meant that she could sit this way with someone without the silence feeling like something to fill. Christmas in Cedar Ridge was nothing like Christmas in Harrisburg, and was better in ways she hadn't expected. In Harrisburg, Christmas had been a formal affair. Her father's house, particular traditions, particular foods, the particular strain of a holiday engineered for a family that no longer had its center person. She'd gone through the last 2 Christmases at home with the competence she brought to most things, and the specific knowledge that the competence was covering something she'd rather not look at directly. Cedar Ridge had no such formality. The community assembled on Christmas Eve in the largest building in town, which was the saloon, whose owner, Frank Delacroix, had 2 good qualities. He made no fuss about religion, and he made excellent food, the combination of which made his establishment the practical center of any gathering that required space and provisions. She went with Martha, who dressed for the occasion in a way that suggested she'd been saving particular reserves of opinion for a public venue. Peter the clerk came too, and seemed, for the first time since she'd known him, not entirely miserable about being in Wyoming. Nathan was there. He arrived after she did and found her in the way he'd gotten into the habit of finding her in public spaces, directly, without the kind of circling that less certain people did. He brought her a cup of something warm from the stove near the back wall and stood beside her in the way that said something to the room that they hadn't exactly discussed saying, but that both of them had, she thought, arrived at being comfortable with. Roy Alderman came over and shook her hand, a gesture that surprised her with its formality. "Jim read to me last night," he said. "Whole page. Didn't stop once." She looked at him. Behind his roughness, there was something that she recognized now. A man who'd been carrying grief a long time and was looking at his youngest son reading and feeling it ease slightly, the way grief sometimes eased when something good entered the same space. "He worked very hard," she said. "He did," Roy agreed. "He said you made him." He paused. "That you didn't let him pretend he couldn't when he was just scared." She thought about Jim at the desk, pressing his mouth together. "He was never not going to get there," she said. "He just needed to believe that first." Roy Alderman nodded and moved on, and she stood with the warm cup and let the room be what it was. This particular gathering of people in a saloon on Christmas Eve in Wyoming, which was its own kind of thing, unglamorous and real. Nathan, beside her, said nothing. He was good at that, being present in a way that didn't require comment. She was learning, still, that presence without performance was not a small thing to offer. Eat. January was hard in ways that December hadn't been, though she'd been warned. The cold got serious in January in the way that made everything a negotiation. The schoolhouse stove demanding more wood, the walk from Martha's requiring more layers, the children arriving in states of cold that took the first half hour of every morning to reverse. She taught in her coat for 2 weeks straight. Thomas started wearing 2 scarves, one on top of the other, which was practical, but gave him the appearance of a very studious mummy, which she did not point out. The cold didn't stop things, though. That was what she was still adjusting to about this place. The cold was a condition to be managed, not an excuse. People moved through it and worked in it and made decisions in it, and the children came to school in it, and the school continued. Margaret Peterson had been in school every day since October, when Evelyn had visited the Peterson farm. She was one of the most consistent attendees in the class, which Evelyn suspected had something to do with the specific stubborn integrity of a child who had been fought for and was honoring that, consciously or not. She'd moved through 2 primer levels in 3 months. In January, she started working on writing that went past copying. Her own sentences, her own observations, written in careful penmanship with the particular concentration of someone taking something seriously. Evelyn read Margaret's writing exercises the way she read all of them, for what they said beyond what they said. Margaret wrote about practical things, the farm, the animals, a description of how to make butter that was the most precisely written piece of technical instruction in the class by a considerable margin. Underneath the practicality, there was a noticing, a way of seeing the ordinary things and putting them into words that was more than just description. She wrote a note on one of Margaret's exercises, not praise, more like recognition. This is how good writing works. It sees the thing clearly and puts what it sees into the right words. You did both. She handed it back and watched Margaret read the note and watched Margaret's face not do anything obvious. Just take the information in and sit with it. Good. Try. The proposal came in March, and it came the way things came from Nathan, directly, without a great deal of theatrical buildup, in a moment that was so ordinary it was extraordinary by contrast. They were at the schoolhouse on a Saturday afternoon. Spring was beginning its negotiations with the winter. The cold still present, but with a different quality, less absolute, the light shifting in ways that promised something. She'd been reorganizing the bookshelf that had arrived in a February supply delivery. 3 new primers, 2 geography books, a collection of poems that she'd had mixed feelings about but had ordered anyway. And Nathan had been at the back of the room doing something with the leg of a desk that had developed a wobble. She'd been aware of him the way she was always aware of him in a room now, not anxiously but simply. The way you were aware of the stove when it was going, a background warmth that registered without demanding attention. "Evelyn," he said. She looked up. He'd set down the tool he'd been using and was looking at her with an expression she hadn't seen before. Not the recalibration, not the settled post-blizzard look, something older and less guarded than either of those. Slightly uncertain in the way that men who were rarely uncertain looked when they found themselves there. She waited. "I've been thinking," he said. "About the desk?" she said. "About you," he said. "About us." He paused. about whether you'd marry me. The room was very quiet. The stove was going, and somewhere outside a horse on the main street was doing what horses did, and the light through the windows had that early spring quality, not warm yet, but no longer withholding. She set down the book she'd been holding. She looked at him. "You've been thinking about whether I'd marry you," she said, "or thinking about asking me?" "Both," he said, "in that order." "What did you decide?" she asked. "About the first part." He held her gaze. "That I didn't know," he said, and that not knowing wasn't a good enough reason not to ask. She stood there with her hand resting on the reorganized bookshelf and thought about September. The train, the wooden sign, the night by the road. She thought about Nathan Reed's lantern coming through the dark, and his flat, uncomplicated yep when she'd thanked him for stopping. She thought about the lumber and the fixed door and the coffee in tin cups in the January cold, and the blizzard, and 3 hours in the back room of the hardware when the shape of things between them had changed permanently. She thought about what she wanted. She was not a woman who had spent a great deal of time imagining what marriage would look like, because the versions available to her in Harrisburg hadn't looked like things she wanted. What she'd wanted was the teaching and the work and the life that was actually hers, and she'd come to Wyoming to get those things, and she had them. Nathan Reed was not the dream she'd been chasing. He was something she hadn't known to want because she hadn't known people like him existed. A man who fixed things quietly, who walked through blizzards without ceremony, who sat with her in comfortable silences and said, "I didn't know that," when I was walking through the storm and meant it straight through with no performance in it. "The ranch," she said. "What would teaching look like from the ranch?" "Same as it looks from Martha's," he said. "You ride in, or I bring you." "And the mornings? I'm here before 7. "I'm up before 5, he said. "We'd manage." "I'm not going to stop teaching," she said. "I know," he said. I'm not asking you to." She looked at him for a long moment. He held the look with the steadiness that was one of his fundamental qualities. Not stubbornness, something more patient than that, a willingness to let things be what they were and wait for them to resolve. "Yes," she said. He let out a breath. Not dramatically, just the breath of a man who'd been holding something and had set it down. "All right," he said. "All right," she agreed. He crossed the room and she didn't move, and he took her hand in both of his, which were large and work-roughened and warm, and held it in the simple way of someone doing the thing they meant to do without making more of it than it was. She felt the warmth of his hands and the particular quality of the moment, imperfect, real, nothing like the version in the dime novels, and found it was exactly right for that reason. "I don't have a ring," he said. "I didn't think that far ahead." "That's fine," she said. "I'll get one," he said. "When you get one," she said, "there's no urgency." He looked at her. "There's some urgency," he said, which was the closest to romance she'd heard from him, and was, she decided, the right amount. The town found out the way small towns found out things, which was to say immediately and through Martha Elwood. She hadn't told Martha. She'd gone back to the boarding house after the schoolhouse on Saturday afternoon with the information sitting inside her in the quiet, private way of something still new, and she'd been at supper with the normal face she presented at supper, and Martha had looked at her for precisely 15 seconds before she said, "Something's happened." "Nathan asked me to marry him," Evelyn said. There didn't seem to be a reason to be indirect about it with Martha. Martha sat with this for a moment. Something moved through her expression. Not surprise, no, more the look of a woman confirming what she'd known for a while. "And you said yes," she said. Not a question. "I said yes," Evelyn confirmed. Martha pointed her fork at her again. "That man has been fixing things in your school since September," she said. "He fixed the sign before you'd been here 24 hours. "I know," Evelyn said. "He doesn't fix things for people," Martha said. "He fixes things, not for people." "I know," Evelyn said again. Martha looked satisfied in the particular way of someone whose read on a situation has been validated. "You'll want a spring wedding," she said, "before the mud gets bad." "I haven't thought about the timing," Evelyn said. "I have," Martha said, and produced a look that suggested the wedding planning was already well underway in the organized country of her mind, and that Evelyn's role in it would be primarily to show up and make decisions when required. The next morning at church, Martha's church, which Evelyn attended for community rather than conviction, 3 separate women found occasion to speak to her before the service, each of them aware and each of them expressing things that were different on the surface and the same underneath. A welcome. Not the polite welcome of September, not the cautious accommodation of October. Something more genuine, more final. She was known here now, and being known was different from being merely present. Walt Dunmore shook her hand and said he was glad she'd stayed, which from Walt Dunmore was a speech. Roy Alderman tipped his hat. Cecily Dunmore caught her eye from across the room and did nothing but look at her directly, which from Cecily was the equivalent of a long emotional declaration. She stood in the cold sunlight outside and thought about the woman who had sat on a suitcase in the Wyoming wilderness in September, in the gathering dark, counting the things she knew and didn't know. That woman was still there, not gone, not transformed into someone else, still capable of the inventory, still making the lists, still getting annoyed when the arithmetic didn't make sense. But she was in a different place now, surrounded by people she knew and who knew her. And the difference between those two positions, alone in the dark with the counting, or standing in the cold light with people who had decided she was theirs, was something she didn't have a word for but didn't need one. Some things were just true, and the truth of them didn't require naming. She found Nathan afterward standing near his horse at the edge of the gathering with the slightly removed look of a man who was attending a social event because he'd decided to rather than because it came naturally. She walked over and stood beside him, and they looked at Cedar Ridge together. The mud of the early spring roads, the frame buildings with their winter-battered signs, the children running between the adults with no regard for the cold, the whole ordinary, imperfect life of the place. Second thoughts? He asked. No, she said. Good, he said. You? She asked. He looked at her sideways. No, he said. Good, she said. They stood there in the cold, in the not quite spring, in the ordinary day that was also, for both of them, something more than ordinary. She thought about what came next. The spring, the wedding, the ranch, the teaching, all of it unresolved and incomplete and real, and didn't find any of it frightening. She reached over and took his arm, which she'd never done before in public, and felt him straighten slightly and then settle, the way people settled when something they'd been waiting for arrived. The cold was still cold. The mud was still mud. Cedar Ridge was still exactly what it was, small and imperfect and demanding, a place that had not made things easy for her and had not apologized for that. She had not made things easy for it either. That seemed about right. The letter to her father was the hardest letter she'd ever written, and she'd written some difficult ones. She sat at the small desk in her room at Martha Elwood's boarding house on a Sunday evening in late March, with the lamp turned up and the wind doing its quiet, early spring business outside, and she wrote 3 versions before she arrived at the one she sent. The first was too formal. She could hear herself hiding behind the structure of it, the way she sometimes did when she wasn't sure how to say a thing directly. The second was too much the other direction, emotional in a way that felt performative, like she was trying to write the letter her father expected rather than the one that was true. The third one started in the middle, which was where the truth usually was. Dad, Nathan Reed has asked me to marry him, and I've said yes. I want you to know this before you hear it some other way, and I want you to come if you're willing. Not because I need your permission, which I think we both know at this point I don't, but because you're my father and this matters, and I'd like you here. The wedding will be in May, before the mud season gets serious. Martha Elwood, who runs the boarding house where I've been staying, has already decided most of the details, and I expect she's right about most of them. I know what you're going to say about Wyoming and about marrying a man you've never met. I know you're going to worry. You can worry and still come. Those aren't the same thing. Nathan is a good man, not a perfect one, but a good one, which I've come to think is rarer and more worth having. She read it back. It was honest, which she'd decided was the only thing a letter to her father should try to be. She folded it and addressed it and took it to the post the next morning before school, which was also before 7, which meant she stood in the cold outside the post office for 4 minutes, waiting for Briggs's assistant to open up, which was not comfortable but was necessary because if she waited until after school, she'd talk herself into revising it again. She slid it through the slot and walked to the schoolhouse and lit the stove and started the day. Spring came to Cedar Ridge in the tentative, negotiated way it came everywhere in Wyoming, not arriving so much as gradually overcoming, the cold giving ground slowly, and then more quickly, and then all at once, the way resistance sometimes worked. The mud season Evelyn had been warned about manifested in mid-April with a commitment that made the winter seem, in retrospect, like it had been cooperating. The roads became a project. Main Street acquired a character that was best described as ambitious, in the sense that it aspired to be a road and hadn't quite gotten there. The children came to school muddy in ways that took on a daily ritual quality. Boots left at the door, in a row that increased in size from Jim Alderman's small pair to Thomas's, which had grown 2 sizes since September, in the way boys' boots did when you weren't paying attention. She'd started keeping a rag by the door, which became a communal object used with varying degrees of thoroughness depending on the child. School in April was different from school in September, and not only because of the mud. The children were different, not unrecognizably, not in any single dramatic way, but in the accumulated way of 8 months of actual learning. Thomas had moved past the arithmetic gap so completely that she'd given him problems that went beyond the curriculum, things she'd pulled from a mathematics primer meant for older students, and he worked through them with the focused pleasure of someone who'd found the thing they were good at and was finding out how far it went. Jim read now. He read every day, anything she gave him, and he read at home, and Roy Alderman had reported with the same flat practicality he brought to everything that Jim had been found reading by lamplight past his bedtime on 3 separate occasions, which Roy had mentioned with the tone of a man who disapproved in theory and was secretly satisfied in fact. Margaret Peterson was writing, not just the exercises, her own things, in a composition book Evelyn had ordered from the supply catalog and given to her in February with no instruction beyond use, this however you want. She'd been using it. Evelyn had read some of it at Margaret's request, not all of it, and what she'd read had the particular quality of writing done by someone who was discovering language as a tool for seeing, rough in places, uneven, occasionally excellent in ways that surprised both of them. You should keep going with this, Evelyn had told her. It's just writing, Margaret said. Writing is not just anything, Evelyn said. Writing is how people keep what they know from disappearing when they're gone. Margaret had looked at her for a moment with those contained eyes. Is that why you do it? She asked. The letters and the grade books and everything? Evelyn thought about her mother at the kitchen table with the reading primer. Partly, she said. Yes. Her father's reply came in the second week of April. It was 2 pages, shorter than his last letter, longer than she'd expected given the subject matter. He said the things she'd anticipated, that Wyoming was far, that he hadn't met Nathan Reed, that he had questions. He said the things she hadn't anticipated, that he'd read her letters over the winter and they were different from the letters she'd sent from Harrisburg, that there was something in them he recognized from her mother's letters. When her mother was young and had gone somewhere new and was telling him about it, that the something he recognized was a person who had found the place where they were supposed to be. He said he'd come. She read that line 3 times. He'd come. She sat at the small desk and held the letter and felt something move through her that was too complicated to name simply. Relief and love and the specific ache of a relationship with a parent that was improving slowly and imperfectly, which was the only way those relationships improved when they did. She wrote back that afternoon. 2 lines. I'm glad. Martha Elwood will have a room for you. She'll have opinions about everything. You'll manage. Nathan met her father at the train station on the 2nd Thursday of May. She'd asked to come, and Nathan had said yes, but she'd watched him say yes and understood that he'd rather have had this particular conversation with her father on his own first, man to man. The way men did things that she found inefficient but had learned to read as meaningful. She went anyway because it was her father and her life, and she was not going to pretend otherwise. But she stood a little back from them when they shook hands and let the 2 men look at each other for a moment before she stepped forward. Her father had aged since September, or perhaps she'd aged in how she saw him, the gap between the man and the idea of the man closing in the way it closed when you'd been away from someone long enough to see them as a person rather than a role. He was smaller than she remembered, not diminished, just actual, a man in his mid-50s with gray at his temples and a good coat and the expression of someone who was trying to take in a great deal of information quickly without letting the trying show. He looked at Nathan. He looked at the town, at Cedar Ridge in May, which was its best version, The mud receding and the light generous, and the cottonwoods along the creek doing their brief yellow-green thing that lasted maybe 2 weeks before they settled into full summer. He looked at Evelyn. "You look well," he said. "I am well," she said. He nodded. Not the tight jaw of September, not the folded arms, something quieter than those. "The school," he said. "Can I see it?" She took him. They walked down Main Street together, her father and Nathan slightly awkward in their proximity, the way men were when they were deciding about each other. And she showed him the schoolhouse, which was clean and organized and had, above the door, a sign that read Cedar Ridge School in even, well-painted letters, repainted by Nathan in April because the repaired version had started to chip. Her father stood in the doorway and looked at the rows of desks and the clear windows and the blackboard with the week's geography lesson still written on it in her handwriting. He looked at the bookshelf with the new primers. He looked at the row of small boots by the door. "You built this," he said. "I fixed it," she said. "It was already here." "You know what I mean," he said. She did. She let the acknowledgement be what it was. He spent 4 days in Cedar Ridge. He stayed in the room Martha Elwood had prepared for him with the thoroughness she brought to all preparations, and he ate at her table, and Martha had opinions about the eastern states and about Pennsylvania specifically that she shared freely, and her father received them with more equanimity than Evelyn had expected. On the second day, he went with Nathan to see the ranch. She didn't go. She had school, and she had the obscure sense that the two of them needed the time without her as an intermediary. They came back in the late afternoon and were quiet in the comfortable way of people who'd had a real conversation and didn't need to recap it for an audience. "He knows what he's doing," her father told her that evening, in a tone of someone whose criteria had been met. "I know," she said. "The drainage in the south pasture needs fixing," he said. "He knows," she said. Her father looked at her for a moment with something in his face that was not comfortable for him. She could see that, but that he decided to say anyway. "Your mother would have liked it here," he said. I'm not saying that to make a point. I just think she would have." She held this. "I think so too," she said. He nodded. He looked at his coffee cup. He was not a man who was good at this kind of conversation, but he was trying, and she'd decided years ago that trying was what she needed from him more than facility. "I was wrong," he said, "to make it difficult when you left." "You were scared," she said. "That's different." "Same result," he said. "Not always," she said, "and you're here now." He looked up at her. "I'm here now," he agreed. It wasn't a resolution exactly. It wasn't the tying off of every loose thread between them, because those threads were long and tangled and would take more than 4 days in Cedar Ridge to sort through completely. But it was a start of a different kind, both of them in the same place, looking at the same thing, willing to say the true thing even when the true thing was uncomfortable. She thought her mother would have been satisfied with that. It wasn't perfect. It was real. The wedding was on a Saturday in the 3rd week of May. Martha Elwood had, as predicted, arranged most of it, which Evelyn had permitted on the grounds that Martha's organizational capability was considerable and largely going to waste in the management of a boarding house with 3 guests, and this seemed like a more appropriate deployment of it. The result was a ceremony in the open air at the north end of Cedar Ridge, where the creek ran through the cottonwoods, and the light at 10 in the morning had a quality that seemed chosen rather than accidental. She wore a dress that had been her mother's, altered to fit by a woman named Josie Trevitt, who had a talent for such things, and had worked on it for 2 weeks without complaint. The dress was cream-colored and plain in the way her mother had liked things. Nothing excessive, nothing that required constant maintenance to look right. It fit, and it was her mother's, and those 2 facts together were enough. The people who came were the people of Cedar Ridge, which was to say nearly everyone. Roy Alderman with Jim beside him, Jim in a shirt that was clean for the occasion, and shoes that were clean for the same reason. The Peterson family, Hank Peterson standing with his hat in his hands the way he always did when he was somewhere that required a slight adjustment of his usual mode. Briggs from the general store, who had apparently decided to close for the morning, which he had never done for anything in Evelyn's experience. Thomas was there with his mother, who Evelyn had spoken to a dozen times at school events, and who had a warmth that her son had learned to mostly conceal but had not entirely succeeded at. Thomas stood in his good clothes and watched the proceedings with the serious attention he brought to everything, and at one point caught Evelyn's eye and gave her a small, precise nod that she interpreted, correctly she thought, as approval. Cecily Dunmore stood with her family at the edge of the gathering. She was wearing her hair differently, down instead of braided, which for Cecily was a significant departure. And she was watching with an expression that Evelyn couldn't read at first and then could. Someone watching a thing happen and understanding it as evidence of something possible. That the doing of a life on your own terms was not theoretical, that it could be actually done. Evelyn caught her eye for a moment. Cecily lifted her chin slightly. That was all, and it was enough. Her father stood to her left throughout. He didn't say much. He was not a man who said much in the best of circumstances. And this was not the best of circumstances for a man who struggled with emotion. This was a situation that required him to be a father at the exact moment he'd realized, too late, what that had always meant. But he was there. He stood straight and he watched his daughter, and he did not look like a man with regrets about being present, which was the most she'd asked of him and more than she'd been certain of getting. Nathan, beside her, was Nathan. Same boots, cleaner shirt, the particular stillness of a man who had decided something and was at peace with the decision. He looked at her when the officiant asked him to, and what was in his face was not performance. It was just what was there, which was enough, which was more than enough. They said the words. The words were simple, which suited both of them. Afterward, Frank Delacroix had food at the saloon because that was how things worked in Cedar Ridge. And the afternoon became the kind of afternoon that small communities knew how to produce. Not elegant, not planned to the last detail, but full of the ordinary life of people who knew each other and were glad of each other's company. Children ran. Adults talked. Briggs and Roy Alderman had a prolonged disagreement about the price of feed that had nothing to do with the occasion and everything to do with them, which was fine, which was how it should be. Her father left on Monday. She walked with him to the station and they stood on the platform with the Wyoming morning around them, which was nothing like the Harrisburg platform from September. This one she knew. This one she'd walked past 4 times a week for 8 months, and the familiarity of it was its own kind of thing. "Come at Christmas," she said. "If you want." "I might," he said, which from him was yes. He boarded the train. She watched it go the way she'd watched the train go in September, from a platform with the Wyoming sky above it, but the watching was different from every possible direction. She wasn't frightened. She wasn't hoping to be met. She was a woman watching a train carry her father east, knowing exactly where she was and who she was and what she was going back to. She walked back through Cedar Ridge to the schoolhouse because it was Monday and school was on even when you'd gotten married 2 days before, which was not a question anyone had thought to ask, and which she had therefore not addressed preemptively. The school year ended in June, and it ended the way things ended when they'd been built properly. Not with drama, but with a quiet sense of completion that was its own reward. The last day of school was a Friday, and she did something she hadn't planned. She asked each of the children to say one thing they'd learned that year. Not necessarily from her. Anything. Something they'd learned in the room, or outside it, or from each other. The exercise was voluntary and imprecise, and she wasn't sure what she expected from it. Jim Alderman said, "I learned to read," in a tone that suggested he was still somewhat surprised by this, as if reading was a skill he'd acquired in passing without fully intending to and was still taking the measure of. Thomas said, "I learned that arithmetic and reading are the same thing, kind of. They're both just a language." She looked at him. He looked back with the expression of someone who had worked this out and was testing it. It was, she thought, not wrong. Margaret Peterson said, "I learned that writing something down makes it more real." She said this quietly, with the particular conviction of someone who had discovered rather than been taught. Polly said she'd learned that you could miss a lot of school and still catch up, which was practical and also true. Cecily, who was not technically a student but was in the room and had been all year, said nothing for a moment. And then she said, "I learned that you can want something out loud, and it doesn't have to kill you." The room was quiet for a beat. "No," Evelyn said. "It doesn't." She and Nathan had been at the ranch for 3 weeks when she understood something that she'd been circling without landing on since September. She understood it on an ordinary morning, June, the light coming in through the ranch house windows that Nathan had rebuilt the frames of in April, the coffee on the stove, the sound of Dill out in the yard doing the morning chores with his characteristic efficiency and silence. She was sitting at the table going over the supply list for the fall school term, which she was already planning because planning was how she worked, and September came whether you were ready for it or not. Nathan came in from outside and poured coffee and sat across from her and looked at what she was doing and didn't say anything. And she looked at him across the table and didn't say anything, and the morning continued around them. What she understood was this. She had come to Wyoming running towards something, but she hadn't known what the something was. She'd called it the teaching position. She'd called it independence, a new start, a life that was hers. Those were all true, as far as they went. But the thing underneath them, the thing she'd been oriented toward without having a name for it, was this: a life that was actually inhabited, not endured, not gotten through, not arranged into acceptable form, and maintained. She'd grown up watching her father maintain. He was good at maintaining, keeping the surface even, managing what could be managed, staying functional through things that should have broken him. She'd thought for a long time that this was strength. She'd thought for a long time that the alternative was falling apart. What Wyoming had taught her, through 8 months of cold and mud, and 14-year-old girls who wanted things out loud, and boys who read past their bedtime, and one man who walked through blizzards without making a speech about it, was that there was a third option between maintaining and falling apart. It was called being in it. Actually in it. The hard and the good, and the incomplete and the real, all of it at once, without managing the surface and without losing the thread. Her mother had known this. That was what her father's letter had been trying to say, the one about the kitchen table in Harrisburg. Her mother had been in things. She thought about what it cost to live that way, to let things actually matter, to be moved by what was moving and troubled by what was troubling and glad about what was good, without putting glass between yourself and the experience. It cost something. It always cost something. But the alternative was the life where you arrived at the end of a thing and realized you'd been watching from a safe distance the entire time, and that seemed like a worse cost. "You're thinking," Nathan said. "Always," she said. "What about?" She looked at him across the table, at the man who'd fixed her floor and her door and her sign, who'd walked through a blizzard and said, "I didn't know that. When I was walking through the storm and had meant every word, who was not perfect and not finished and not particularly romantic, but was present in every room he walked into in a way that she found daily more valuable than she'd known to look for." "About whether I've learned anything this year," she said. "Have you?" "I think so," she said. "I'm still working out what?" He nodded, accepting this as an answer, because it was. Jeffs. In September, when the new school year opened, there were 14 children in Evelyn Hart Reed's classroom. The 2 new ones were younger siblings of children from the previous year. Word had gotten out, as word did in small places, that the school was worth attending. 14 desks, 2 of them brought from storage and repaired over the summer by Nathan and by Dill, and on a Saturday afternoon by Roy Alderman, who had come by unasked and spent 3 hours with a set of tools he'd brought from his own place. "You didn't need to do that," she told him when he was loading the tools back into his wagon. "Jim wanted to help," he said. "He's too young for the tools, so I came and he watched." She looked at Jim, who was standing near the wagon with a proprietary expression. "Good," she said. "Next year he can help." Roy Alderman looked at her with the direct look he'd been giving her since October of the previous year, the one that had taken her a while to read and that she knew now meant that he was being sincere. "Thank you," he said, "for the boy." "He did it himself," she said. "I just didn't let him pretend he couldn't." Roy nodded. He got in the wagon and drove home, and Jim ran toward the schoolhouse with the enthusiasm of a child who had been away from a place over the summer and missed it, which was not how children were supposed to feel about school, and was therefore, she thought, the best possible sign. Cecily Dunmore arrived that first morning of September looking different in a way that Evelyn identified after a moment. She was carrying herself differently. The particular shift of someone who'd had a conversation and come through it changed. She was not wearing her coat. "You talked to your father," Evelyn said. "In July," Cecily said. "Walt Dunmore is not—" She paused. "He doesn't change his mind the first time, or the second. He changes it around the 5th. How many times did you try?" "4," Cecily said. Then I told him I was going to write to the teacher training college in Cheyenne with or without his blessing, and he said that was a waste of stamps. And I said the stamps were mine, and he looked at me for a long time and said, "All right." Evelyn looked at her. 15 years old, serious face, hair back in its practical braid, standing in the doorway of a schoolhouse at 6:45 in the morning because this was where she needed to be. "The application needs 2 letters of recommendation," Cecily said. "I was hoping." "Yes," Evelyn said. "Sit down. We have 20 minutes before the children arrive. Tell me what the application needs." Cecily sat. She produced a folded paper from her coat pocket. The application requirements, written in her precise handwriting, copied from somewhere, and spread it on the desk. They worked through it together in the early September morning, the light coming through the windows that were windows again. The stove not yet needed but present and ready. The smell of the room, the particular smell it had taken on over the course of a year. Chalk and wood, and the faint residual ghost of determination. The children arrived at 7. Evelyn stood at the front of the room and looked at 14 faces in various states of morning readiness, from Thomas's alert and already slightly ink-stained presence in the second row, to a new small girl in the front whose name was Annie, and who was looking at the blackboard with the expression of someone taking the measure of a new country and deciding whether it was worth staying in. Evelyn had looked at this room in October and thought it felt like a place that had been given up on. She thought now that this was what given up on places looked like when someone stopped giving up. Not perfect, not finished, not different in the bones, but inhabited in a way that changed everything that mattered. She picked up the chalk. "Good morning," she said. "Let's get started." Outside, Cedar Ridge went on being Cedar Ridge, the muddy, impractical, wonderful, difficult, ordinary town that had not wanted to welcome her, and had ended up doing it anyway, in the slow, grudging way that real welcoming worked, the kind that meant something because it had been earned rather than extended as a courtesy. The creek ran cold through the cottonwoods. The horses stood at the rail in front of the general store. Nathan Reed was at his ranch doing the work of the morning, the practical, real work of a man who had built something solid and was building it still. And in the schoolhouse on the north end of Birch Street, 14 children sat at their desks with the Wyoming September morning coming through the windows, learning the thing that Evelyn Hart Reed had come 2,000 miles to teach them. Not just reading and arithmetic and geography, not just the subjects on the board, but the thing underneath those, that who you are is not fixed, that what you want out loud doesn't have to kill you, that the life that is actually yours is the one you show up for, imperfect and unfinished and fully inhabited every ordinary day. That was the whole of it. That was what she'd learned and what she was teaching and what she suspected she'd spend the rest of her life still working out, because some things were like that. Not answered once, but returned to, the understanding deepening each time, the way a river deepened the same channel year after year without changing where it ran. She wrote the first lesson on the board. She began.